In 1897, an Irish theatre manager named Bram Stoker published a novel about a Transylvanian count who drank blood and could transform into a bat. He borrowed the name from a 15th century prince known for impaling his enemies. But the real history of vampires and werewolves extends far deeper than Victorian fiction, back through centuries of documented cases, medical mysteries, and folklore that shaped how humanity understood death disease and the monsters that might walk among us. Tonight we explore the true history behind these legends. Not the Hollywood versions or the romantic fantasies, but the actual people, events, and beliefs that created our most enduring monsters. We'll meet Vlad of Wallachia, whose brutal methods of maintaining power would inspire literature's most famous vampire. We'll examine the case of Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess accused of horrific crimes, whose story raises uncomfortable questions about truth, power, and propaganda. We'll investigate the vampire epidemics that swept through Eastern Europe in the 1720s, prompting official investigations and reports that reached the highest levels of government. And we'll discover how diseases like rabies and porphyria might have fed supernatural beliefs, creating monsters from misunderstood medical conditions. This journey is built on historical records, forensic science, and scholarly research, the work of historians, anthropologists, and medical experts who have examined the evidence with care. But it's also a human story about how communities made sense of death and disease, how fear and folklore intertwined, and how the monsters we create reveal as much about ourselves as about any supernatural threat. We'll trace these legends from ancient Mesopotamia through medieval Europe to modern popular culture, examining how vampires and werewolves have evolved to reflect each era's particular anxieties and desires. We'll move thoughtfully through this material, taking time to understand the historical context, to examine the evidence, and to consider multiple perspectives. This is a journey designed for nighttime listening, steady, unhurried, and perfect for falling asleep while remaining intellectually engaging for those still awake. Our exploration unfolds across several interconnected themes. We begin with the historical figures whose names became synonymous with vampirism, Vlad and Elizabeth, examining who they really were versus what legend made them. We then turn to medical explanations, exploring diseases that created vampire-like symptoms, and the science of decomposition that convinced communities they had discovered the undead. From there, we trace the ancient roots of these legends across civilizations, discovering how independently cultures around the world created blood-drinking monsters and shapeshifters. We'll see how these folklore traditions transformed through literature in the 19th century, creating the sophisticated vampires that would dominate popular imagination. And we'll conclude by examining how these monsters continue to evolve in contemporary culture, becoming metaphors for identity, otherness, and the complexities of modern life. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey into the real history of vampires and werewolves, a history stranger and more fascinating than any fiction. The Prince of Wallachia. In the autumn of 1456, a prince rode through the Carpathian Mountains toward a throne that had been stolen from his family 3 times. His name was Vlad, son of Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon, and he was coming home to Wallachia with an army at his back and a reputation for cruelty that preceded him. He was 25 years old. Within months, his methods of maintaining power would become legendary, and 4 centuries later, his name would be borrowed by a novelist to create the most famous vampire in literature. But who was the real Vlad III? And how did a medieval prince from a small Eastern European principality become forever associated with the undead? To understand Vlad, we must first understand the world he inhabited. Wallachia was a principality roughly the size of present-day South Carolina, situated between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River. In the 15th century, it occupied one of the most dangerous pieces of real estate in Europe, caught between 3 competing powers. To the west lay the Kingdom of Hungary, a Catholic realm that viewed Wallachia as a buffer state and vassal territory. To the south and east sprawled the Ottoman Empire, expanding rapidly under Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople just 3 years before Vlad's return. And within Wallachia itself rival noble families, the boyars constantly schemed to place their preferred candidates on the throne. The average reign of a Wallachian prince in this era lasted less than 3 years. Violence was the currency of power. Vlad was born in 1431 in the Transylvanian town of Sighișoara. His father, Vlad II, had recently been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity against Ottoman expansion. This honor gave him the surname Dracul, the Dragon, in Romanian. Young Vlad would become Dracula, son of the dragon. It's worth noting that Dracul also means devil in Romanian, a linguistic coincidence that would take on significance in later centuries. In 1442, when Vlad was 11 years old, his father made a calculated political decision that would shape the boy's understanding of power. To maintain his throne and keep peace with the Ottomans, Vlad II sent his 2 younger sons, Vlad and his brother Radu, to the Ottoman court as hostages. They would remain there for 6 years. What those years were like, we can only partially reconstruct. The boys lived in Edirne and later Egrigöz, learning Turkish, studying the Quran and receiving military training. Vlad proved difficult. Contemporary accounts suggest he was frequently punished for his defiance. His younger brother Radu adapted more successfully, eventually converting to Islam and becoming a favorite of the future Sultan Mehmed II. The experience taught Vlad several lessons: that loyalty was conditional, that power required ruthlessness, and that the Ottoman military machine was both efficient and terrifying. He also learned firsthand the Ottoman method of execution for serious crimes: impalement. While Vlad was a hostage, his father's political calculations collapsed. In 1447, Vlad II was assassinated by Wallachian boyars allied with Hungary. Vlad's older brother Mircea was captured, tortured, his eyes burned out with hot stakes, and buried alive. Young Vlad, still in Ottoman custody, learned that in Wallachia, losing power meant losing everything, including your life. The Ottomans released him in 1448, backing his first attempt to claim the throne. He held it for 2 months before being driven out. He would spend the next 8 years in exile planning his return. When Vlad finally secured the throne in 1456, he moved with decisive brutality. His primary targets were the boyar families who had killed his father and brother. On Easter Sunday, 1459, Vlad invited the leading boyar families to a feast at his court in Târgoviște. After the meal, he arrested them all. The older boyars and their families were impaled on stakes surrounding the palace. The younger, stronger boyars were force-marched 50 miles north to the ruins of a fortress overlooking the Argeș River. There they were, put to work rebuilding the fortification that would become Castle Pânare, Vlad's mountain retreat. They worked in their fine Easter clothes until the garments rotted off their bodies. Few survived. This was the beginning of Vlad's reign of terror, or depending on your perspective, his campaign to centralize power and eliminate corruption. The historical record of Vlad's atrocities comes primarily from German pamphlets printed in the 1480s and 1490s, shortly after the printing press made mass production of texts possible. These pamphlets, illustrated with woodcuts showing Vlad dining among forests of impaled victims, circulated throughout the Holy Roman Empire. They describe him impaling thousands of Saxons after a dispute over trade rights in Brașov. They claim he forced a mother to eat her own child. They report that he nailed the turbans of Ottoman ambassadors to their heads when they refused to remove them in his presence, saying he wished to strengthen their faith. How much of this is true, historians continue to debate. The German pamphlets were produced by Saxon merchants whom Vlad had indeed punished. He was trying to break their monopoly on trade and reduce their political influence in Transylvania. They had every reason to exaggerate his cruelty. Similarly, Ottoman sources describe Vlad's brutality in detail, but the Ottomans were his primary enemies, and such accounts served to justify their military campaigns against him. Even the numbers vary wildly. Some sources claim he impaled 20,000 people, others suggest far fewer. Yet there's enough consistency across multiple sources, German, Ottoman, Russian, and even some Wallachian, to confirm that Vlad did use impalement extensively and publicly. Impalement was not unique to Vlad. It was a recognized form of execution in the medieval world, particularly in the Ottoman Empire. What made Vlad unusual was the scale and systematization of the practice. He used it not just as punishment, but as psychological warfare and political theater. When Ottoman scouts approached his capital in 1462, they found a forest of the impaled, thousands of stakes bearing the bodies of Ottoman prisoners and Wallachian criminals arranged in geometric precision. The sight was so horrifying that some Ottoman soldiers refused to advance further. But here's what makes Vlad's story complex rather than simply monstrous. Within Wallachia, his reputation was mixed. Later, Romanian folklore sometimes remembers him as a harsh but just ruler who brought order to a chaotic land. Stories circulated about his intolerance for theft. He supposedly placed a golden cup by a public well, and no one dared steal it. He attacked corruption among merchants and nobles with the same violence he used against foreign enemies. To some of his subjects, this made him a strong leader in a time when strength meant survival. Vlad's reign lasted only 6 years. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed personally led an army of 90,000 men against Wallachia. Vlad couldn't match such numbers. He retreated using scorched earth tactics and guerrilla warfare. Eventually, he fled to Hungary, expecting support from King Matthias Corvinus. Instead, Matthias imprisoned him for 12 years, possibly because Vlad knew too much about Matthias's own dealings with the Ottomans. Possibly because Matthias wanted to keep him as a potential future asset. During this imprisonment, more stories about Vlad's cruelty circulated, many likely invented or embellished. Vlad was released in 1474 and made one final attempt to reclaim his throne in 1476. He succeeded, but his third reign lasted only 2 months. In December 1476, he was killed in battle near Bucharest. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some sources say he was killed by Ottoman forces. Others suggest assassination by his own men. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed displayed it on a stake as proof that his enemy was finally dead. Vlad's body was reportedly buried at Snagov Monastery on an island in a lake north of Bucharest, though excavations in the 1930s found no conclusive evidence. Vlad's story might have remained a footnote in Eastern European history, a brutal medieval prince among many brutal medieval princes. But his reputation survived in folk tales and those German pamphlets that continued to circulate, and in Russian manuscripts that portrayed him as both monster and defender of Christendom. His name, Dracula, lingered in historical memory waiting. In 1890, an Irish theater manager named Bram Stoker began researching a novel about vampires. He read widely about Eastern European folklore and came across references to Vlad Dracula in a book about Wallachia. Stoker knew almost nothing about the historical Vlad. His research notes contain only basic information and several errors. But he liked the name, and he liked the association with Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains. He borrowed the name Dracula and the Transylvanian setting, then created a character that had almost nothing to do with the historical prince. Stoker's vampire was immortal, sophisticated and supernatural, everything the real Vlad was not. The irony is profound. Vlad Tepes was a mortal man who used extreme violence as a political tool in a violent age. He drank no blood, lived no longer than his contemporaries, and had no supernatural powers. Yet his name became synonymous with the most famous vampire in literature, and through that association he achieved a kind of immortality he never sought. Today, tourists visit Romania looking for Dracula's castle, usually ending up at Bran Castle, which Vlad may have visited once or twice, but never owned. The real Castle Poenari, which Vlad actually built and used, stands in ruins far less visited. What Vlad's story reveals is how historical figures become legends through a complex process of truth propaganda, cultural transmission, and creative reinvention. The German pamphlets served political purposes, discrediting a prince who threatened Saxon interests. The Ottoman accounts justified military action against a dangerous enemy. Later, Romanian folklore rehabilitated him as a national hero who defended his land. And finally, a novelist 4 centuries later borrowed his name to create something entirely new, transforming a medieval prince into an immortal monster. This transformation from man to legend to vampire sets the stage for our exploration. Because the question we're really asking isn't just who was Vlad, but rather how do real people, real diseases, and real violence become supernatural legends? Vlad's story is the first piece of that puzzle. From the mountains of Wallachia, our journey continues to another castle, another noble, and another legend of blood. This time involving a countess whose alleged crimes would rival even Vlad's reputation for cruelty, and whose story raises equally difficult questions about truth, power, and the creation of monsters. The Blood Countess of Čachtice. From the violent world of Vlad's Wallachia, we move west to the Kingdom of Hungary, where another noble's name would become synonymous with bloodshed and monstrosity. But unlike Vlad, whose brutality was public and political, the crimes attributed to Countess Elizabeth Bathory allegedly occurred behind castle walls, targeting not soldiers or political enemies, but young women from her own estates. Her story raises a different kind of question. When accusations of horrific crimes emerge against a powerful woman, how do we separate truth from political convenience, misogyny from justice, and legend from historical fact? In the early months of 1611, rumors circulated through the courts of Vienna and Prague. They spoke of a Hungarian countess who had been imprisoned in her own castle, walled into a set of rooms with only small slits for food and air. The whispers claimed she had tortured and killed dozens, perhaps hundreds of young women. Some said she bathed in their blood, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. The countess was Elizabeth Bathory, and her case would become one of the most debated in the history of serial murder. But the truth, as historians have discovered, is far more complex than the legend. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August 7, 1560, into one of the most powerful noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary. The Bathorys were not merely aristocrats, they were kingmakers. Her uncle Stephen Bathory was Prince of Transylvania and later King of Poland. Another uncle, Andrew Bathory, was a cardinal. Her family owned vast estates across Hungary and Transylvania, and their wealth rivaled that of the Hungarian crown itself. Elizabeth received an education exceptional for a woman of her era. She was literate in Hungarian, Latin, and German. She managed complex financial affairs and corresponded with scholars. In 1575, at age 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander known as the Black Knight of Hungary, for his prowess in fighting Ottoman forces. The marriage brought together two of Hungary's wealthiest families. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave Elizabeth Čachtice castle and the surrounding estates in present-day Slovakia. For the next 25 years, while Ferenc spent most of his time at war, Elizabeth managed these vast holdings. She oversaw agricultural production, collected taxes, administered justice, and handled financial matters. Contemporary records show she was an effective administrator. She also bore 4 children who survived to adulthood, 3 daughters and a son. By all accounts, she fulfilled the expected roles of a noble wife and a state manager. Ferenc died in January 1604, possibly from an infected wound sustained in battle. Elizabeth was 43 years old, a widow with substantial wealth and property. Under Hungarian law, she retained control of her estates and her widow's portion of Ferenc's property. This made her one of the wealthiest women in the kingdom, and some historians argue a target. The trouble began around 1604 or 1605, though the exact timeline remains unclear. Young women who worked as servants in Bathory's households began to disappear or die under suspicious circumstances. Some families reported that daughters sent to work at Čachtice castle never returned. Others claimed their daughters came back with burns, bruises, or stories of abuse. Local Lutheran ministers began recording unusual numbers of deaths among young women associated with Bathory's estates. But for several years, nothing was done. Elizabeth Bathory was too powerful, too well connected, and too wealthy to be easily challenged. By 1610, however, the rumors had reached King Matthias II of Hungary. This timing is significant. The king owed Elizabeth's family an enormous debt, approximately 17,000 Hungarian florins, a sum equivalent to several tons of gold. If Elizabeth were convicted of crimes, her property could be confiscated, and the debt would disappear. Some historians see this as the primary motive for what happened next. Others argue that the evidence of crimes was simply too substantial to ignore any longer. The truth likely involves both factors. King Matthias ordered his palatine, the highest-ranking noble in Hungary, Count György Thurzo, to investigate. Thurzo was also Elizabeth's cousin by marriage, which added another layer of complexity. On the night of December 30th, 1610, Thurzo led a raid on Čachtice castle. What they found or claimed to find became the basis for the legend. According to Thurzo's letters to the king, they discovered a young woman, dead in the castle, another dying, and others imprisoned, and showing signs of torture. Thurzo reported finding instruments of torture and evidence of systematic abuse. In the months that followed, investigators collected testimony from over 300 witnesses, servants, local officials, other nobles, and alleged survivors. These testimonies, recorded in trial documents that still exist in Hungarian archives, describe systematic torture beatings, with clubs and whips burning with hot irons, and candles' exposure to freezing temperatures, starvation, and various forms of mutilation. Some witnesses claimed to have seen dozens of bodies. Others spoke of a registry kept by one of Báthory's servants that listed over 600 victims. The testimonies paint a picture of a household where torture was routine and where young women, particularly those from poor families, were treated as disposable. 4 of Báthory's servants were arrested and tried: Janos Udvari, nicknamed Fichko, Ilona, Jo Dorotia Sentes, and Catalin Benetsky. Under torture, the standard method of interrogation in this era, they confessed to participating in the torture and murder of young women. They implicated Elizabeth as the instigator and primary perpetrator. In January 1611, 3 of them were executed with extraordinary cruelty. Their fingers were torn out with hot pincers before they were burned alive. The 4th, Catalin Benetsky, received a lighter sentence because she was deemed less culpable. But here's what makes this case so problematic for historians. Elizabeth Bathory herself was never formally tried. As a member of the high nobility, she could not be prosecuted in a regular court without the king's explicit permission and a trial by her peers. King Matthias wanted her executed publicly, but her family, still enormously powerful, opposed this. They feared the scandal would damage the Bathory name and potentially lead to the confiscation of all family properties. A compromise was reached. Elizabeth would be imprisoned in her own castle, but not formally convicted or executed. In early 1611, Masons walled Elizabeth into a set of rooms in Čachtice castle. They left only small openings for food and air. She remained there for nearly 4 years, attended by guards who passed meals through the slots. She died on August 21, 1614, at age 54. A local woman who delivered food reported finding her dead, lying face down on the floor. She was buried in the Bathory family crypt, though her body was later moved, possibly because locals objected to her burial in consecrated ground. So what actually happened? The evidence is deeply problematic. The testimonies come almost entirely from servants interrogated under torture, a method known to produce unreliable confessions. Many witnesses were Bathory's enemies, people she had punished for theft or other offenses, or who had financial disputes with her. The numbers vary wildly, and impossibly some accounts claim dozens of victims, others hundreds with no physical evidence to support the higher numbers. No mass graves were ever found. The alleged registry listing 600 victims was never produced as evidence and may never have existed. Moreover, the political context cannot be ignored. King Matthias had strong financial motives to see Elizabeth disgraced. Her wealth and independence as a widow made her vulnerable in a patriarchal society that was deeply uncomfortable with powerful women. The accusations against her fit patterns, seen in other cases where powerful women were targeted sexual deviance, cruelty, and unnatural behavior. The fact that she was never formally tried denied her the opportunity to defend herself or challenge the evidence. Some modern historians, particularly Tony Thorne and Kimberly Craft, argue that Elizabeth may have been entirely innocent, the victim of a political conspiracy to seize her wealth. They point to the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on tortured testimony, and the convenient timing of the accusations. Others, like Raymond McNally, believe the core accusations were likely true, even if the numbers were exaggerated. They note that multiple independent witnesses reported similar stories, and that some testimony came from people with no apparent motive to lie. A middle position suggests that Elizabeth may have been guilty of abusing servants, a practice that, while horrific, was not uncommon among nobility of the era, but that the scale of the crimes was greatly exaggerated for political purposes. The torture and death of servants would have been criminal but might not have led to prosecution, had Elizabeth not been so wealthy and had the king not been so indebted to her family. What we can say with certainty is this: young women died in connection with Elizabeth Bathory's households. Whether this was murder abuse that led to death or the normal mortality rate for servants in that era remains debated. Elizabeth was imprisoned without trial based on testimony extracted under torture. Her wealth and property were effectively seized, and the king's debt to her family was erased. And the legend that grew around her case, particularly the story of bathing in blood, to preserve youth, appeared only in the 18th century, more than 100 years after her death, with no basis in the original trial documents. The blood-bathing legend seems to have originated with Jesuit scholar Laszlo Turoczi, who published an account in 1729 that included this detail. It wasn't in any of the original testimonies from 1610-1611. This addition transformed Elizabeth from an accused murderer into a vampire-like figure, a woman who literally consumed youth and beauty. The image proved irresistible and has dominated popular understanding of the case ever since. Elizabeth Bathory's story reveals how accusations of monstrous behavior can serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They can be tools of political power, expressions of misogyny against women who violate social norms by being too wealthy or too independent, and possibly, though we cannot be certain, descriptions of actual crimes. The case demonstrates the difficulty of extracting historical truth from sources contaminated by torture, political motivation, and centuries of legend building. It also shows how easily a historical figure can be transformed into a monster, especially when that figure is a woman who wielded power in ways that made her contemporaries uncomfortable. Whether Elizabeth Bathory was a serial killer, a victim of political conspiracy, or something in between, her story became a template for vampire legends, particularly the idea of the aristocratic predator who feeds on the young and beautiful to maintain eternal youth. Like Vlad before her, she became more famous as a monster than she ever was as a historical person. From these two nobles, whose names became synonymous with vampirism, we turn now to a scientific explanation for vampire legends, a rare disease that causes symptoms eerily similar to the traits attributed to the undead, and that sparked a controversial theory about the medical origins of supernatural beliefs. The disease that mimicked vampirism. We've examined how historical figures like Vlad and Elizabeth became associated with vampirism through a combination of actual violence, political propaganda, and legend building. But what if some vampire legends originated not from human cruelty, but from human illness? What if communities observing people suffering from a rare disease interpreted symptoms they couldn't understand as evidence of the supernatural? In May 1985, at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Los Angeles, biochemist David Dolphin from the University of British Columbia presented a paper that would capture international attention. His theory was startling vampire legends he proposed might have originated from observations of people suffering from porphyria, a group of rare blood disorders that produce symptoms remarkably similar to the traits attributed to vampires in folklore. The presentation made headlines worldwide. Here finally was a scientific explanation for supernatural beliefs, a rational answer to an ancient mystery. But as medical historians and porphyria specialists would soon point out, the reality was considerably more complex than the headlines suggested. To understand Dolphin's theory and the controversy it sparked, we need to understand what porphyria actually is. The term refers to a group of 8 related genetic disorders, all affecting the body's production of heme, the iron-containing component of hemoglobin that allows red blood cells to carry oxygen. Heme is produced through a complex biochemical pathway involving 8 different enzymes. If any of these enzymes is deficient due to genetic mutation, intermediate compounds called porphyrins accumulate in the body. Depending on which enzyme is affected and where porphyrins accumulate, different types of porphyria result, each with distinct symptoms. The most relevant form for Dolphin's theory is congenital erythropoietic porphyria, or CEP, sometimes called Günther's disease, after the physician who first described it in 1911. CEP is extraordinarily rare. Medical literature documents only about 200 cases worldwide since its identification. It results from a deficiency in the enzyme uroporphyrinogen 3 synthase. When this enzyme doesn't function properly, porphyrins accumulate in red blood cells, plasma bones, teeth, and skin. The symptoms of severe CEP are striking. Patients experience extreme photosensitivity exposure to sunlight, causes excruciating pain and severe blistering. The skin becomes fragile and easily damaged. Over time, repeated sun exposure causes progressive scarring and disfigurement. The skin on the face and hands can become thickened and darkened, taking on a leathery appearance. In severe cases, the nose and fingers may be partially destroyed by repeated photosensitive reactions and secondary infections, creating a corpse-like appearance. Porphyrins accumulate in the teeth, causing them to fluoresce reddish-brown under ultraviolet light, a phenomenon called erythrodontia. The gums may recede due to the disease's effects on connective tissue, making the teeth appear more prominent, almost fang-like. Excessive hair growth, called hypertrichosis, can occur on the face and body. The disease causes severe anemia as the malformed red blood cells are destroyed faster than normal. Fingers and toes may curl and stiffen due to damage to skin and tendons. Some patients develop sensitivity to garlic, which contains a compound that can trigger symptoms in certain types of porphyria. Reading this list of symptoms, the connection to vampire folklore seems obvious: aversion to sunlight, corpse-like appearance, prominent teeth, excessive hair, and even sensitivity to garlic. Dolphin's theory went further. He suggested that medieval porphyria sufferers, desperate for relief, and somehow understanding that their problem involved blood might have consumed blood as folk medicine. Blood contains heme, and Dolphin proposed that drinking blood might have temporarily alleviated symptoms by providing the heme that patients' bodies couldn't produce properly. This, he argued, could explain the vampire's need to drink blood. The theory was elegant, scientific, and immediately appealing. It offered a rational explanation for seemingly irrational beliefs. Major news outlets reported it widely. The connection between Porphyria and vampires entered popular culture, appearing in novels, television shows, and films. Even today, many people accept it as established fact. But medical historians and Porphyria specialists responded with significant criticism. The problems with Dolphin's theory are numerous and substantial. First, Porphyria is extremely rare. C-Ep, the form with the most vampire-like symptoms, affects perhaps 1 in several million people. Even if we include all forms of Porphyria, the prevalence is only about 1 in 75,000. For such a rare disease to generate widespread, consistent folklore across multiple cultures and centuries seems statistically improbable. Second, most forms of Porphyria don't produce the dramatic symptoms Dolphin described. The most common form, Porphyria cutanea tarda, causes skin blistering and fragility, but not the severe disfigurement or photosensitivity of CEP. Acute intermittent porphyria, another relatively common form, causes abdominal pain and neurological symptoms, but no photosensitivity or physical disfigurement at all. Only CEP produces the full constellation of vampire-like symptoms, and it's vanishingly rare. Third, Porphyria is genetic, not contagious. Vampire legends consistently feature transmission. Through bites, the vampire creates new vampires. A genetic disease cannot explain this central feature of vampire mythology. Dolphin's theory doesn't account for the infectious nature of vampirism in folklore. Fourth, and perhaps most damning, there is no historical evidence that Porphyria patients ever drank blood or were mistaken for vampires. Medical historians have searched historical records extensively. They found no documented cases of Porphyria patients consuming blood as treatment. They found no accounts of Porphyria sufferers being accused of vampirism or subjected to vampire prevention burial practices. The connection exists in theory, but not in historical record. Fifth, drinking blood wouldn't actually help. The heme in consumed blood would be broken down by stomach acid and digestive enzymes before it could be absorbed in a form useful for treating Porphyria. Modern treatment for severe Porphyria involves intravenous heme infusions, direct injection into the bloodstream, precisely because oral consumption doesn't work. Medieval Porphyria sufferers drinking blood would have experienced no medical benefit. Sixth, the timeline doesn't match. Vampire legends existed long before the medieval period that Dolphin's theory focuses on. Ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman sources describe blood-drinking entities and the undead. These legends predate any possible medieval Porphyria cases by thousands of years. Dr. Paul Barber, author of Vampires, Burial, and Death, points out another issue. The symptoms of Porphyria don't actually match vampire folklore very well when examined closely. Folklore vampires are typically described as bloated and ruddy, not emaciated and disfigured. They're often depicted as stronger than normal humans, not weakened by disease. The photosensitivity in Porphyria causes pain and blistering, but it doesn't cause immediate dramatic effects, like the instant destruction depicted in vampire fiction, a detail that came from literature, not folklore. Despite these substantial criticisms, Dolphin's theory persists in popular culture. Why? Perhaps because it satisfies a deep desire to rationalize the irrational, to find scientific explanations for supernatural beliefs. It's intellectually satisfying to think that vampire legends have a medical basis, that our ancestors were observing real phenomena and simply misinterpreting them. The theory also demonstrates how scientific-sounding explanations can gain acceptance even when the actual science doesn't support them. Interestingly, Dolphin himself later acknowledged many of these criticisms and moderated his claims. In subsequent interviews, he emphasized that he had proposed Porphyria as one possible contributing factor to vampire legends, not the sole explanation. But by then, the simplified version of his theory had already entered popular consciousness. The Porphyria theory does serve one valuable purpose. It reminds us that people in earlier eras were observing real phenomena and attempting to explain them with the knowledge available to them. When we dismiss historical beliefs as mere superstition, we risk missing the observations that underlay those beliefs. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were working with incomplete information and different explanatory frameworks. Moreover, the theory highlights how rare diseases can profoundly affect those who suffer from them. People with CEP face not just physical symptoms, but also social isolation and psychological trauma. In earlier eras, before the disease was understood, they would have faced even greater stigma and fear. Whether or not they were mistaken for vampires, they certainly experienced the horror of being trapped in bodies that reacted painfully to sunlight, that looked increasingly disfigured, and for which no treatment existed. Modern medicine has made progress in treating porphyria, though severe cases remain challenging. Patients are advised to avoid sunlight, use protective clothing and sunscreen, and in some cases receive regular blood transfusions or intravenous heme infusions. Bone marrow transplantation has shown promise for CEP. But even today, people with severe porphyria face significant quality of life challenges. The porphyria vampire theory, despite its scientific weaknesses, reveals something important about how we construct explanations for the world around us. We seek patterns, connections, and rational frameworks for understanding phenomena that frighten or confuse us. Sometimes these explanations are correct. Sometimes they're elegant but wrong. The persistence of Dolphin's theory in popular culture, despite scholarly rejection, demonstrates that a compelling narrative can be more powerful than contradicting evidence, a lesson relevant far beyond vampire legends. Whether or not porphyria contributed to vampire legends, the disease illustrates how medical conditions that we now understand scientifically might have appeared supernatural to earlier generations. It shows how the line between illness and monster can blur when knowledge is incomplete. And it reminds us that behind every legend of the monstrous, there may be real human suffering, people struggling with conditions they couldn't understand, feared and ostracized by communities that saw them as something other than human. From this medical explanation for vampire legends, we turn to documented historical events that fed those legends. As cases where communities became convinced they faced actual vampire attacks, leading to official investigations, exhumations, and reports that reached the highest levels of European government. The vampire epidemics of Eastern Europe. While medical theories offer one explanation for vampire beliefs, documented historical events provide another perspective entirely. In the early 18th century, a series of cases emerged that were investigated, recorded, and reported with bureaucratic precision, creating an archive of vampire belief that would spark debate across Europe and force Enlightenment thinkers to grapple with the collision between folk tradition and rational inquiry. The year 1725 marked a turning point in how vampire cases were documented. In the Serbian village of Kiselova, a man named Peter Plagojewicz died after a brief illness. He was buried according to local custom. Within 8 days, 9 villagers died suddenly, an alarming mortality rate, even in an era when death was common. But what made these deaths particularly disturbing was what the dying claimed, that Plagojewicz had visited them in the night, appearing at their bedsides and strangling them. The village fell into panic. This wasn't merely illness. It was something supernatural, something evil. The villagers demanded that authorities exhume Plagojewicz's body. What happened next would normally have remained local folklore lost to history, like countless other village superstitions. But Kisilova was located in territory that had recently changed hands. The region had been part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries, but the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718 had transferred it to Austrian Habsburg control. This meant that when villagers demanded exhumation, they weren't appealing to Ottoman officials who might have been familiar with such beliefs, but to Austrian administrators who were required to file reports up the chain of command. Bureaucracy, it turned out, would preserve what oral tradition might have forgotten. The local Habsburg official, Provisor Frombald, supervised the exhumation. His report filed on July 31st, 725, describes what witnesses claimed to observe. Plagojewicz's body showed no signs of decomposition, though he had been buried for more than a week. Fresh blood appeared around his mouth. His hair and nails seemed to have grown. The old skin had peeled away, revealing what appeared to be new skin beneath. When villagers drove a wooden stake through the corpse's heart, witnesses reported that fresh blood flowed from the wound and from the ears and mouth. The body was then burned to ashes. Frombald's report is remarkably matter-of-fact. He doesn't express skepticism or belief. He simply documents what occurred and what witnesses claim to observe. The report made its way through Habsburg administrative channels, eventually reaching Vienna. Officials there didn't know quite what to make of it. Was this superstition, mass hysteria, or something that required further investigation? The Plagojewicz case might have remained an isolated curiosity, but 6 years later, an even more detailed case emerged that would capture the attention of all Europe. In 1731, in the Serbian village of Medveja, a former soldier named Arnold Paule returned from military service in Greece. Paule told neighbors a disturbing story. While serving in Greece, he had been attacked by a vampire. He had sought protection by eating earth from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with the vampire's blood, traditional remedies in Balkan folklore. Despite these precautions, Paule seemed troubled and anxious. In the autumn of 1726, Paule died in a fall from a hay wagon. He was buried in the village cemetery. Within a month, 4 people died, suddenly. Before dying, they claimed Paule had visited them at night. The village suspected vampirism. 40 days after Paule's burial, the traditional waiting period in Orthodox Christian practice, villagers exhumed his body. They reported finding the corpse undecayed with fresh blood around the mouth and nose. Following traditional practice, they drove a stake through the heart. Witnesses claimed the corpse groaned when staked, and that blood spurted from the wound. They burned the body and reburied the ashes. They also exhumed and burned the bodies of the 4 people who had died after claiming Paule visited them, fearing they too had become vampires. The matter seemed resolved. But 5 years later, in 1731, another wave of sudden deaths struck Medveja. 17 people died within 3 months. The community again suspected vampirism. But this time, the Habsburg military administration decided to conduct a thorough official investigation. They sent a team led by regimental field surgeon Johannes Flückinger, along with other military medical officers, to investigate and document everything systematically. What Flückinger and his team produced was remarkable, a detailed medical and legal report titled Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered, dated January 7, 1732. The document is extraordinary in its precision and detail. It names witnesses, describes the investigation methodology, and documents the exhumation and examination of 40 bodies from the village cemetery. For each body, the report notes the state of decomposition, the presence or absence of blood, and any unusual features. The report describes how some bodies appeared completely fresh, despite having been buried for weeks or months, how blood was found in the chest cavities, and how some corpses appeared to have grown new skin, hair, and nails. Imagine being present at these exhumations, the winter ground of a Serbian village, frozen and hard, the smell of disturbed earth mixing with the odor of decay. Military officers in their uniforms, standing alongside local officials and terrified villagers. Bodies lifted from graves examined by candlelight or winter sun with scribes recording every detail. The systematic nature of the investigation, 40 bodies you each carefully documented, gives the report an air of scientific inquiry, even as it describes phenomena that Enlightenment science couldn't explain. The visum et repertum was signed by 5 military officers and countersigned by a lieutenant colonel. It was filed with military headquarters copied and began circulating through official channels, but it didn't remain buried in military archives. Copies reached Vienna, then spread to other European capitals. The document was published and translated. By 1732, educated Europeans across the continent were reading detailed descriptions of vampire exhumations conducted under official military supervision. The response was immediate and polarized. The cases sparked intense debate among Enlightenment intellectuals, theologians, and medical professionals. Here was documented evidence, signed by military officers, no less of phenomena that seemed to defy natural explanation. How should rational people respond? Some sought natural explanations. French botanist and philosopher Antoine Augustin Calmet published a treatise in 1746 examining vampire reports. He considered various possibilities: premature burial, where victims might have been buried alive and shown signs of movement when exhumed; misunderstanding of decomposition processes; epidemic diseases that caused similar symptoms in multiple victims; and mass hysteria amplifying natural phenomena. German physician Michael Ranft published De Masticatione Mortuorum in Tumulis, on the chewing of the dead in their tombs in 1728, arguing that the phenomena could be explained by natural decomposition processes and the power of imagination. Others saw evidence of supernatural activity. Some theologians argued that demons could animate corpses. Some suggested that these were genuine cases of the dead returning, though they debated whether this was demonic possession or some other supernatural mechanism. The debates became heated with accusations of superstition on one side and rationalist arrogance on the other. What's particularly fascinating is how these debates reflected the broader tensions of the Enlightenment era. This was a time when traditional beliefs were being challenged by new scientific methods and rational inquiry. The vampire cases became a battleground for these competing worldviews. Could everything be explained by natural causes, or did the supernatural still have a place in understanding the world? How should educated people respond to folk beliefs held by peasant communities? When multiple witnesses, including educated military officers, reported the same phenomena, how should that testimony be weighed? The Habsburg government eventually took action to end the controversy. Empress Maria Theresa, who ruled from 1740 to 1780, was troubled by the vampire reports and the social disruption they caused. In 1755, she sent her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate vampire claims in the empire. Van Swieten was a prominent Dutch physician and a committed rationalist. His report was dismissive. He attributed all vampire phenomena to natural decomposition, ignorance, and superstition. Based on his recommendations, Maria Theresa issued an official decree in 1755 that prohibited the exhumation and desecration of corpses without official permission. The decree didn't deny the existence of vampires that would have been too controversial, but it effectively ended state-sanctioned vampire hunting by making such practices illegal without bureaucratic approval that would rarely be granted. The decree worked, at least officially. Vampire exhumations conducted with government oversight largely ceased in Habsburg territories. But the beliefs themselves didn't disappear. They simply went underground, continuing in rural communities without official sanction or documentation. These vampire epidemics of the early 18th century are significant for several reasons. First, they provide detailed documentation of folk beliefs and practices that might otherwise have been lost. Because the cases occurred in newly Habsburg territories, where officials were required to file reports, we have preserved accounts of beliefs and practices that were likely common throughout Eastern Europe, but rarely recorded in such detail. Second, they reveal how communities understood death and disease in this era. The vampire explanation made sense within their worldview. When multiple people died, suddenly when bodies didn't decompose as expected when dying people reported visitations, these phenomena needed explanation. The vampire provided a framework that explained the evidence and suggested remedies. It wasn't irrational superstition. It was a coherent explanatory system based on observation and tradition. Third, the cases demonstrate the collision between folk belief and Enlightenment rationalism. The debates sparked by the visum et repertum forced educated Europeans to grapple with how to respond to documented phenomena that didn't fit their emerging scientific worldview. The responses ranged from dismissal to attempted natural explanation to acceptance of supernatural causes. This tension between traditional belief and rational inquiry would continue to shape European thought throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Finally, these cases influenced the development of vampire fiction. When writers like John Polidori and later Bram Stoker created their literary vampires, they drew on these documented cases. The details from the visum et repertum, the undecayed corpses, the blood, the staking became elements of vampire fiction. The Serbian setting of many cases influenced Stoker's choice of Transylvania for Dracula's origin. Historical documentation fed literary imagination, which in turn shaped popular understanding of vampires. The vampire epidemics of Eastern Europe occurred at a unique historical moment when traditional beliefs collided with Enlightenment rationalism, when bureaucratic documentation preserved what might have remained oral tradition, and when educated Europeans were forced to confront phenomena that challenged their emerging scientific worldview. The result was a rich archive of belief, practice, and debate that continues to fascinate historians and inform our understanding of how communities make sense of death, disease, and the unknown. From these documented vampire cases in Eastern Europe, we turn to Western Europe and a different kind of monster, one that walks on 4 legs rather than 2, and whose attacks on humans were so numerous and well documented that they became a matter of royal concern in 18th century France. The Beast of Gévaudan. From the vampire epidemics of Eastern Europe, where communities feared the dead returning to prey upon the living, we move to a different kind of terror in Western Europe, one that walked on 4 legs, hunted in daylight as well as darkness, and left a trail of death so extensive that it became a matter of royal concern and national obsession. On June 30th, 1764, a young woman named Jeanne Boulet was tending cattle in a pasture near the town of Langogne in the Gévaudan region of south-central France. Without warning, an animal emerged from the forest and attacked her. The cattle, sensing danger, formed a protective circle around her, their horns facing outward, a defensive behavior that likely saved her life. The creature retreated. Jeanne survived to describe what had attacked her, a beast larger than any wolf she had ever seen, with a broad chest, reddish fur with dark stripes, and a tail thicker than any normal wolf's. It was the first recorded attack by what would become known as the Beast of Gévaudan, and it marked the beginning of 3 years of terror that would claim between 60 and 100 lives and generate thousands of pages of official reports, eyewitness accounts, and contemporary analysis. The Gévaudan region, roughly corresponding to the modern department of Lozère, was rural, mountainous, and sparsely populated. Most inhabitants were peasant farmers and shepherds living in small villages and isolated farmsteads. Wolves were not uncommon in the region. They were a known danger, particularly to livestock. But what began attacking people in the summer of 1764 was unlike any wolf the locals had encountered. The attacks were frequent, bold, and targeted humans, rather than livestock, a pattern that contradicted normal wolf behavior. The first confirmed kill occurred on June 30th, 1764, the same day as Jean Boulit's attack, but in a different location. 14-year-old Jean Boulet, a different person with the same name, was killed while tending sheep. The pattern that would characterize the attacks was already evident. The victim was young female and alone or with other children. The creature had targeted the head and neck, inflicting massive trauma. Over the following months, attacks occurred with alarming frequency, sometimes multiple attacks in a single week. Witnesses who survived attacks or observed the creature from a distance provided remarkably consistent descriptions. The beast was larger than a normal wolf, with some estimates suggesting it was the size of a calf or a small cow. It had a very broad chest and shoulders, giving it an unusual silhouette. Its fur was reddish-brown, with a dark stripe running along its back. The tail was long, thick, and bushy, thicker than a wolf's tail. Its head was large with small pointed ears. Some witnesses mentioned a foul smell. Most strikingly, many observers noted that the creature seemed unafraid of humans, would attack in daylight, and displayed what seemed like unusual intelligence in selecting victims and evading hunters. The attacks followed patterns that disturbed contemporary observers. The beast primarily targeted women and children, particularly those tending livestock alone in fields or forests. Adult men were rarely attacked, and when they were, the beast often retreated if they fought back vigorously. The creature showed a preference for attacking the head and neck, often decapitating or nearly decapitating victims, a pattern unlike typical wolf attacks which usually target limbs and the torso. The beast sometimes killed without eating its victims, another behavior inconsistent with a hungry predator, and it displayed what witnesses interpreted as intelligence. It seemed to study potential victims before attacking, to learn from failed attacks, and to avoid areas where hunters were concentrated. By autumn of 1764, the attacks had caused widespread panic. Local hunters organized drives to kill wolves in the region, but the attacks continued. The Bishop of Minde, the regional religious authority, declared the beast a scourge sent by God to punish the people's sins, ordering special prayers and processions. Reports reached Versailles, and King Louis XIII took personal interest in the matter. In January 1765, he sent Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, a professional wolf hunter with a team of experienced hunters and hounds. Duhamel and his team spent months hunting in Gévaudan. They killed numerous wolves, over 100 by some accounts, but the attacks continued. In June 1765, frustrated by Duhamel's failure, the king recalled him and sent François Antoine, the royal gun-bearer and one of France's most celebrated hunters. Antoine was given extensive resources, soldiers to organize drives, funds to pay informants and local hunters, and the authority to requisition supplies and assistance from local officials. Antoine approached the hunt systematically. He studied attack patterns, interviewed witnesses, and organized large-scale drives involving hundreds of beaters to flush the creature from forests. On September the 21st, 1765, during one such drive in the forest of Tenazere, Antoine shot a large wolf. The animal was unusually large, weighing approximately 130 pounds, significantly heavier than typical wolves, and matched many witness descriptions. Antoine had the wolf preserved and sent to Versailles, where it was examined by naturalists and put on display. King Louis XV declared the matter resolved and awarded Antoine a substantial reward. But the attacks didn't stop. After a brief pause, they resumed in December 1765. This created a significant problem. The king had officially declared the beast dead, yet people were still being killed. The attacks continued through 1766 and into 1767, though they received less official attention and documentation than before. The royal government, having declared victory, was reluctant to acknowledge ongoing attacks. The end came on June 19, 1767. A local hunter named Jean Chastel was participating in a hunt organized by a local nobleman, the Marquis d'Apcher. According to the account, Chastel was positioned at his assigned post, reading a prayer book when an animal approached. He shot it with a gun loaded with bullets that, according to legend, had been blessed by a priest. The animal, described as wolf-like but with unusual features, died. When it was cut open, human remains were reportedly found in its stomach. After Chastel killed this creature, the attack stopped permanently. The animal killed by Chastel was preserved and displayed locally, but it was never sent to Versailles for official examination. By the time naturalists expressed interest in examining it, the preserved specimen had deteriorated badly. No reliable scientific description was made, and the remains were eventually lost. This absence of physical evidence has fueled centuries of speculation about what the beast actually was. The theories are numerous and varied. The most straightforward explanation is that the beast was an unusually large wolf or a pack of wolves working together. Wolves can occasionally reach the size described by witnesses, and coordinated pack attacks might explain some of the patterns. However, this doesn't account for the creature's preference for humans over livestock, its unusual appearance, or why it took 3 years, and the efforts of France's best hunters to kill it. Another theory suggests a wolf-dog hybrid. Such hybrids can be larger than pure wolves, may have unusual coloring, and might be less afraid of humans if they have some domestic dog ancestry. In 2016, French naturalist François Fabre published research suggesting the beast might have been a hybrid between a large dog breed and a wolf, possibly bred intentionally by someone who then used it to attack people, a theory that would explain the seemingly directed nature of some attacks. Some historians have proposed that the beast was an exotic animal escaped from a private menagerie. Suggestions include a hyena, which has powerful jaws capable of crushing skulls and a preference for scavenging that might explain attacks on vulnerable humans. Others have suggested a young lion or other large predator. However, no records exist of such an animal escaping from any known menagerie in the region. A more controversial theory suggests that some attacks were committed by humans, either a serial killer using animal attacks as cover, or multiple human murderers taking advantage of the panic. This might explain why some attacks seemed targeted and why the creature sometimes displayed apparent intelligence. However, this theory struggles to explain the consistent animal descriptions from multiple witnesses. Recent analysis of preserved documents and the few remaining physical artifacts has provided some insights. Historian J. M. Smith, in his book, Monsters of the Gévaudan, examined the historical records in detail and concluded that there were likely multiple animals involved, perhaps a wolf-dog hybrid initially followed by normal wolves that learned to prey on humans after the initial attacks created a pattern. This would explain why the attacks continued after Antoine killed his wolf and why they finally stopped after Chastel's kill. What makes the Beast of Gévaudan case particularly significant for understanding werewolf legends is the quality and quantity of documentation. Unlike vampire cases, which were documented primarily by local officials and religious authorities, the beast attacks generated reports from royal hunters, military officers, naturalists, and government administrators. Thousands of pages of contemporary documents survive official reports, witness testimonies, letters, and newspaper accounts. This extensive documentation allows us to examine how a real predator crisis was interpreted, investigated, and ultimately transformed into legend. The contemporary accounts reveal how witnesses struggled to categorize what they were seeing. Many explicitly stated that the creature was not a normal wolf, it was too large, too aggressive, too intelligent. Some witnesses used the term loup-garou, werewolf, to describe it, not necessarily meaning a human transformed into a wolf, but rather something that was wolf-like, yet more than a wolf. The language used in reports often anthropomorphized the creature, describing it as cunning, malicious, or evil, attributing to it qualities beyond animal instinct. The case also demonstrates how real events feed folklore. The beast attacks occurred during a period when werewolf beliefs were declining in educated circles, but remained strong in rural areas. The attacks seemed to confirm traditional beliefs about dangerous supernatural creatures that hunted humans. The fact that the beast was so difficult to kill that it seemed to evade the best hunters, and that it targeted the vulnerable all fit patterns from werewolf legends. The story of Jean Chastel killing the beast with blessed bullets particularly resonates with folklore traditions about the need for special weapons to kill supernatural creatures. The Beast of Gévaudan represents the most extensively documented historical event that fed werewolf legends. It shows how real predator attacks, community fear, and folklore traditions could combine to create something that defied easy explanation, even with extensive official investigation. The case reveals the gap between what people observed a dangerous predator with unusual characteristics and what they could explain with available knowledge. In that gap, legend grew. The attacks killed real people, most of them children and young women from poor families. Their deaths were tragedies that devastated small communities. The beast was real, even if its exact nature remains debated. But the legend that grew from those attacks of a creature that was more than animal, that possessed intelligence and malice, that resisted all attempts to kill it until a blessed bullet finally brought it down, that legend transcended the facts and became part of the broader tradition of werewolf beliefs that would influence literature and popular culture for centuries to come. From this documented case of a predator that fed werewolf legends, we turn to the legal and social dimensions of werewolf belief, examining how European courts tried, convicted, and executed people accused of being werewolves, and what those trials reveal about how societies define the boundaries between human and animal, natural and supernatural. The werewolf trials of early modern Europe. While the Beast of Gévaudan represented a real predator that fed werewolf legends, another dimension of werewolf belief played out in European courtrooms between the 15th and 18th centuries. During this period, hundreds of people were formally accused, tried, convicted, and executed for the crime of being werewolves. The trial records that survive provide a disturbing window into how communities understood transformation, violence, and the very boundaries of what it meant to be human. In 1521, French authorities in the region of Poligny arrested two men, Pierre Burgot and Michel Verdun. Under interrogation and torture, the standard method of extracting confessions in this era, both men confessed to making a pact with the devil. According to their confessions, they had met a man dressed in black who promised them money and protection from wolves if they would renounce God and serve him instead. They agreed. The man gave them an ointment that, when rubbed on their bodies, transformed them into wolves. In wolf form, they claimed to have killed and eaten several children over a period of years. The court found them guilty of lycanthropy, murder, and heresy. On January 8, 1521, Pierre Burgot and Michel Verdun were burned alive in the public square of Poligny. Their case was one of the earliest well-documented werewolf trials, but it would be far from the last. The most infamous werewolf trial occurred in 1589 near Cologne, in what is now Germany. Peter Stump, also known as Peter Stubb, or Peter Stumpf, was a farmer from the village of Eprath. He was accused of being a werewolf for 25 years, during which time he allegedly killed and cannibalized 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and numerous livestock. The accusations emerged after a group of hunters claimed to have pursued a wolf that, when cornered, transformed into Stump. He was arrested and subjected to torture on the rack, a device that stretched the body, dislocating joints and causing excruciating pain. Under torture, Stump confessed to an elaborate narrative. He claimed that the devil had given him a magical belt that, when worn, transformed him into a wolf. In this form, he said he had committed murders over 2.5 decades. He confessed to killing his own son and eating his brain. He admitted to incestuous relationships and to making a pact with a succubus sent by the devil. The confession reads like a catalog of every crime and sin that early modern Europeans found most horrifying. Murder, cannibalism, incest, bestiality, and demonic pacts. Stump's execution, carried out on October 31st, 1589, was designed to match the enormity of his alleged crimes. He was tied to a wheel, and executioners used red-hot pincers to tear flesh from his body in 10 places. His limbs were broken with the blunt side of an axe. He was then beheaded and his body was burned on a pyre. His daughter and mistress, accused of complicity, were strangled and burned alongside him. As a warning to others, authorities erected a pole displaying the torture wheel, topped with Stump's severed head, and the figure of a wolf. The pole stood for years as a reminder of what happened to werewolves. The Stump case generated extensive publicity. A pamphlet describing the trial and execution was printed in German and translated into English, circulating widely throughout Europe. The pamphlet included woodcut illustrations showing Stump's transformation, his crimes, and his execution. It presented the case as factual and well-documented, reinforcing beliefs in the reality of werewolves. In 1598, in the Jura region of France, the Gondelon family was accused of attacking children in wolf form. The case began when a young girl was attacked by what witnesses described as a wolf. The girl's brother fought off the creature, and during the struggle he claimed to recognize it as Pernette Gondéon, a local woman known for eccentric behavior. Pernette was seized by an angry mob and torn to pieces before any official trial could occur. Her brother Pierre, her sister Antoinette, and Pierre's son Georges were then arrested and tried for lycanthropy. Under torture, all 3 confessed to making pacts with the devil, attending witches' sabbaths, and transforming into wolves to attack people and livestock. They were convicted and burned alive. These cases were not isolated incidents. Historian Willem de Blécourt has documented hundreds of werewolf trials across Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries, with concentrations in France, Germany, Switzerland, and the Baltic regions. The trials followed patterns remarkably similar to witch trials, which occurred in the same regions and time periods. Both types of trials involved accusations of making pacts with the devil, attending sabbaths, and causing harm through supernatural means. Both relied heavily on confessions extracted through torture. Both resulted in execution, usually by burning. However, werewolf trials differed from witch trials in significant ways. While witch trials predominantly targeted women, approximately 75 to 80% of accused witches were female werewolf trials, more often accused men. The typical accused werewolf was a poor, marginalized man, often someone who lived on the edges of the community, worked as a shepherd or woodsman, or displayed unusual behavior. The crimes attributed to werewolves were more often violent and physical murder, cannibalism, attacks on livestock, while witches were more commonly accused of causing illness, crop failure, or impotence through magic. The confessions in werewolf trials typically followed certain patterns. The accused would describe making a pact with the devil or a demonic figure, often at a crossroads or in a forest. They would receive some object that enabled transformation: an ointment, a belt, a wolf skin, or sometimes just the devil's permission. The transformation itself was usually described as complete and physical. The person became a wolf in body, not just in spirit or appearance. In wolf form, they claimed to have committed specific murders, often providing details about victims' locations and methods. Some confessions included the claim that they could be wounded in wolf form, and the injury would appear on their human body, a belief that appears in folklore and that prosecutors sometimes used as evidence, pointing to scars or wounds on the accused as proof of their lycanthropy. What's particularly striking about these trials is that courts treated lycanthropy as legally real. Judges and legal scholars debated not whether transformation was possible, but rather its nature and mechanism. Was it a physical transformation, where the body actually became a wolf, or was it an illusion created by the devil where the person believed they had transformed and committed crimes while demons did the actual killing? Legal texts from the period discuss these questions seriously, citing classical authorities, theological arguments, and previous legal cases. The French jurist Jean Bodin, in his influential 1580 work De la démonomanie des sorciers, on the demon mania of witches, argued that lycanthropy was real and should be prosecuted vigorously. He cited biblical and classical sources, contemporary cases, and logical arguments to support the reality of transformation. Other legal scholars were more skeptical about physical transformation, but still accepted that people could commit crimes while under demonic influence or delusion. Medical texts from the period also discussed lycanthropy, though often with more skepticism. Some physicians argued that accused werewolves suffered from melancholy or other imbalances of the humors that caused delusions. They might believe they had transformed and committed murders, but this was mental illness, not supernatural transformation. This medical perspective gradually gained influence during the 17th century as Enlightenment thinking spread. The social context of werewolf accusations reveals much about early modern European society. Accusations often emerged during periods of social stress, religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, economic hardship, food shortages, or outbreaks of disease. They frequently targeted people who were already marginalized, the poor, the mentally ill, those who didn't conform to social norms. In communities where children disappeared or were found dead, where livestock was killed by predators, where unexplained violence occurred, the werewolf accusation provided an explanation and a target for community fear and anger. The trials also reveal anxieties about the boundaries between human and animal civilization and wilderness. The werewolf represented the ultimate transgression, a human who became an animal, who gave in to bestial appetites, who lived outside the laws that governed human society. In an era when Europeans were increasingly defining themselves as civilized in contrast to the savage peoples they encountered through exploration and colonization, the werewolf represented the terrifying possibility that civilization was a thin veneer that could be stripped away, revealing the beast within. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, werewolf trials began to decline. The same Enlightenment rationalism that ended official vampire hunting also affected attitudes toward lycanthropy. Increasingly, authorities viewed accused werewolves not as supernaturally transformed criminals, but as mentally ill individuals who needed medical treatment rather than execution. The last major werewolf trial in Western Europe occurred in 1692 in Livonia, modern Latvia, where an elderly man named Theus claimed to be a werewolf but argued that he and other werewolves fought against witches and demons to protect crops and livestock. The court, confused by this inversion of expectations, eventually sentenced him to a minor punishment for superstition and idolatry rather than for being a werewolf. The werewolf trials left a complex legacy. On one hand, they represent a dark chapter in European legal history. Hundreds of people, many of them mentally ill or simply different, were tortured and executed based on confessions extracted through pain, and on beliefs we now recognize as unfounded. The trials demonstrate how legal systems can be used to enforce conformity and eliminate those deemed threatening to social order. On the other hand, the trial records provide invaluable documentation of folk beliefs, social tensions, and how communities understood violence and deviance. They reveal that behind many accusations were real crimes murdered, children killed, livestock acts of violence that communities struggled to explain and punish. Whether the accused were actually guilty of these crimes, or whether they were scapegoats for violence committed by others or by actual predators, remains debated in individual cases. These trials reveal how societies defined humanity itself, what separated human from animal, what crimes were so heinous that they placed someone outside the protection of human law, and what it meant to lose one's humanity. They show us a world where the boundaries between natural and supernatural, human and animal, were understood very differently than they are today, and where the transformation from human to beast seemed not impossible, but terrifyingly real. From these courtroom dramas where humans were accused of becoming wolves, we turn to a medical explanation for werewolf legends, a disease that, like Porphyria for vampires, has been proposed as a rational explanation for seemingly supernatural beliefs, though with similar questions about whether the science actually supports the theory. Rabies and the monster within. We've explored how courts tried people accused of becoming werewolves, examining the legal and social dimensions of transformation beliefs. But what if the transformation people feared wasn't supernatural at all, but rather the result of a disease, one that literally changes behavior, increases aggression, and spreads through bites, creating new victims who display the same terrifying symptoms? Rabies is one of humanity's oldest documented diseases. Mesopotamian texts from around 2300 BCE describe a disease that causes madness and death in dogs and can spread to humans. The Code of Eshnunna, one of the earliest known legal codes, included provisions for compensating victims of rabid dog bites. Ancient Greek and Roman physicians documented the disease, noting its progression from animal bite to madness to death. For thousands of years, humans have observed rabies and feared it even without understanding its cause. And for perhaps just as long, the symptoms of rabies may have fed legends of monsters, creatures that were once human, but became something else, something aggressive and dangerous, something that spread their condition through bites. Rabies is caused by a virus, specifically a lyssavirus, that attacks the central nervous system. The virus is typically transmitted through the saliva of an infected animal, most commonly through a bite. Once the virus enters the body, it travels along peripheral nerves toward the brain and spinal cord. This journey can take anywhere from a few days to several months, depending on where the bite occurred and how much virus was transmitted. During this incubation period, the victim shows no symptoms and may not even remember the bite that infected them. But once the virus reaches the brain, symptoms begin, and they are both distinctive and devastating. The progression of rabies in humans typically follows a pattern. The first symptoms are often non-specific: fever, headache, fatigue, and discomfort at the site of the bite. This prodromal phase lasts 2 to 10 days. Then the disease enters its acute neurological phase, which takes one of two forms. The more common form, furious rabies, accounts for about 80% of human cases. The less common form, paralytic rabies, accounts for the remaining 20%. It's the furious form that most closely resembles vampire and werewolf legends. Furious rabies causes a constellation of symptoms that align remarkably with supernatural descriptions. The most characteristic symptom is hydrophobia, literally fear of water. Patients develop painful spasms of the throat and diaphragm when they try to swallow liquids. Even the sight or sound of water can trigger these spasms. As a result, patients cannot drink and may foam at the mouth as saliva accumulates. This hydrophobia has a direct parallel in vampire folklore. Vampires cannot cross running water and avoid their reflection in water or mirrors. A rabies victim's inability to swallow an aversion to water mirrors these legendary traits. The disease causes extreme hypersensitivity to stimuli. Bright lights become painful, loud sounds unbearable, strong smells overwhelming. Patients may become agitated by drafts of air or gentle touches. This hypersensitivity corresponds to vampires' aversion to sunlight and in some traditions to garlic and other strong-smelling substances. The neurological effects of rabies provide a medical basis for these supernatural aversions. Rabies fundamentally alters behavior. Patients become agitated, confused, and often aggressive. They may experience hallucinations and delirium. Periods of hyperactivity alternate with periods of calm. Sleep patterns are disrupted with patients becoming more active at night, a reversal that matches the nocturnal habits attributed to vampires and werewolves. In some cases, patients exhibit hypersexuality, another trait associated with vampires and folklore. The disease literally transforms personality and behavior, making the infected person seem like someone or something else. Perhaps most significantly, for vampire and werewolf, Legend's rabies increases biting behavior. The virus benefits from this by making its host aggressive and prone to biting. It ensures its own transmission to new hosts. Infected humans may bite others, spreading the disease. This creates the pattern central to vampire and werewolf mythology. The monster creates new monsters through bites. The contagious nature of the condition, spreading from victim to victim, through bites matches supernatural transmission perfectly. The disease is invariably fatal once symptoms appear. Without modern intensive care, death typically occurs within days of symptom onset, usually from respiratory failure or cardiac arrest. The rapid progression from apparent health to madness to death would have seemed supernatural to observers who didn't understand the disease's mechanism. For werewolf legends specifically, rabies in wolves provides even more direct connections. Wolves are susceptible to rabies and can transmit it to humans through bites. An infected wolf behaves very differently from a healthy one. It loses its natural fear of humans and may approach villages or attack people without provocation. Rather than hunting and killing prey efficiently, a rabid wolf may bite multiple victims without killing them, spreading the disease rather than feeding. The wolf may foam at the mouth, move erratically, and display unusual aggression. A rabies epidemic in wolf populations would create a wave of wolf attacks on humans, with survivors developing rabies themselves days or weeks later. In 1998, neurologist Juan Gomez Alonso published research in the journal Neurology that made a compelling case for rabies as the source of vampire legends. Gomez Alonso noted that rabies epidemics in dogs, wolves, and other animals occurred in Hungary, Transylvania, and surrounding regions between 1721 and 1728, exactly coinciding with the vampire epidemics we examined earlier. The regions where vampire exhumations were most common were the same regions experiencing rabies outbreaks. Gomez Alonso documented the remarkable parallels between rabies symptoms and vampire traits. Beyond the hydrophobia, photosensitivity, and altered behavior, he noted additional connections. Rabies can cause facial muscle spasms that bare the teeth, creating a snarling expression. The disease can cause priapism in men, corresponding to the sexual aspects of vampire legends. Victims may become fixated on biting, and in some documented cases, rabies patients have bitten caregivers or family members. The disease's progression from a bite through a symptom-free period to sudden onset of terrifying symptoms matches the pattern described in vampire legends, where victims of vampire attacks seem fine initially, but then sicken and die, potentially becoming vampires themselves. The rabies theory has significant advantages over the Porphyria theory we examined earlier. rabies was common enough to affect communities rather than just isolated individuals. The disease is contagious through bites, explaining the transmission pattern, central to vampire and werewolf legends. The symptoms are dramatic and visible, providing clear evidence that something was terribly wrong. And crucially, rabies epidemics are documented in the same times and places as vampire and werewolf panics. Historical records support the connection. Medieval and early modern texts describe rabies, outbreaks and their effects. Laws regulated the handling of rabid animals. Medical texts discuss the disease, though without understanding its viral cause. Communities knew that bites from rabid animals could cause madness and death in humans. This knowledge would have been widespread part of the common understanding of dangers in the world. Consider how a rabies epidemic might have appeared to a community without modern medical knowledge. A wolf attacks several people in a village. The wolf behaves strangely unafraid of humans, aggressive, foaming at the mouth. Some victims die immediately from their wounds. Others survive but seem fine. Then weeks later, the survivors begin to show symptoms. They cannot drink water. They become agitated and aggressive. They may try to bite others. They foam at the mouth. They seem transformed into something no longer quite human. They die within days. Then others who had contact with them, perhaps those they bit in their delirium, begin showing the same symptoms. The pattern spreads through the community. Without understanding the viral transmission, how would such a community explain what they were witnessing? The transformation of humans into aggressive, biting creatures that create more of their kind would seem supernatural. The rabies theory also explains why vampire and werewolf legends are so widespread across cultures. Rabies exists on every continent except Antarctica. Any culture with dogs, wolves, bats, or other mammals would have encountered rabies. The disease's symptoms are consistent regardless of where it occurs. This could explain why blood-drinking, biting monsters appear in the folklore of cultures with no historical contact with each other. However, the rabies theory, like the Porphyria theory, has limitations. Not all vampire and werewolf legends align with rabies symptoms. Many vampire traditions don't emphasize the creation of new vampires through bites. That's largely a feature of modern fiction rather than original folklore. Some vampire legends describe bloated, well-fed corpses rather than the emaciated appearance of rabies victims. Werewolf legends often include voluntary transformation through magic or curses, not disease transmission. The theory explains some elements of the legends, but not all. Additionally, communities that experienced rabies epidemics didn't always interpret them as vampire or werewolf attacks. Many historical records describe rabies outbreaks without any supernatural interpretation. People understood, at least to some degree, that bites from mad animals caused madness in humans. The leap from recognizing rabies to believing in vampires or werewolves required additional cultural factors, existing folklore traditions, religious beliefs about demons, and the undead social stresses that made supernatural explanations more appealing. Modern medicine has largely eliminated rabies as a threat in developed countries through animal vaccination programs and post-exposure prophylaxis for bite victims. But the disease remains a significant problem in many parts of the world, killing approximately 59,000 people annually, mostly in Asia and Africa. The vast majority of cases result from dog bites. The disease is preventable through vaccination and treatable if caught before symptoms appear, but once symptoms begin, it remains almost universally fatal. Only a handful of people have survived symptomatic rabies, and most suffered severe neurological damage. Understanding rabies provides insight into how our ancestors might have interpreted a terrifying disease they couldn't prevent or cure. They observed the symptoms, the transformation of behavior, the aggression, the biting, the contagion, and created explanatory frameworks that made sense within their worldview. The vampire and werewolf weren't just monsters. They were attempts to understand and name a real phenomenon that killed people and spread through communities. Rabies represents perhaps the most convincing medical explanation for vampire and werewolf legends. A disease that literally transforms victims into aggressive biting creatures who spread their condition to others, turning the infected into something that seems no longer fully human. Unlike Porphyria, rabies was common enough to affect entire communities. Unlike other diseases, its symptoms align remarkably with supernatural descriptions. And unlike purely cultural explanations, rabies provides a biological mechanism for the transmission pattern central to monster legends. Whether rabies fully explains vampire and werewolf beliefs remains debated among scholars. Most likely the legends arose from multiple sources: rabies, epidemics, attacks by actual predators, misunderstanding of decomposition, cultural anxieties about death and transformation, and the human tendency to create stories that explain frightening phenomena. But rabies almost certainly contributed to these legends, providing real observations that folklore then interpreted and elaborated. From this disease that may have fed monster legends across cultures, we turn to the ancient roots of those legends, examining how vampire and werewolf beliefs appear in humanity's earliest civilizations, suggesting that these monsters address something fundamental to human psychology and culture. Ancient roots Mesopotamia to Rome. We've examined how diseases like rabies might have fed vampire and werewolf legends in medieval and early modern Europe. But these legends didn't originate in the Middle Ages. When we trace them back through history, we find that blood-drinking demons and human-animal transformations appear in humanity's earliest written texts, suggesting that these monsters address something fundamental and timeless in human experience. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, was written in cuneiform on clay tablets around 2100 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia. In this epic, the goddess Ishtar, deity of love, war, and fertility, appears before the hero Gilgamesh and proposes marriage. Gilgamesh refuses recounting the fates of Ishtar's previous lovers. Among them was a shepherd whom Ishtar loved, then transformed into a wolf. The transformed shepherd was then attacked by his own dogs and herdsmen. This brief passage, written over 4,000 years ago, contains key elements that would persist in werewolf legends. Transformation as punishment, the loss of human identity, and the tragic irony of being destroyed by those who once knew you as human. Ancient Mesopotamian culture was rich with demons and supernatural threats. Among the most feared was Lilitu, a female demon who preyed on pregnant women, mothers, and infants. Lilitu was believed to drink blood and steal children in the night. She appears in Sumerian texts from around 3000 BCE and later in Babylonian and Assyrian sources. The demon was described as having wings, talons, and an insatiable appetite for blood. When Hebrew culture absorbed and adapted Mesopotamian mythology, Lilitu became Lilith, who appears in Jewish folklore as Adam's first wife, created equal to him, but cast out of Eden for refusing to submit. In later Jewish tradition, Lilith became a night demon who drinks blood and kills infants, particularly targeting newborns who haven't yet been protected by religious rituals. Ancient Egypt contributed its own blood-drinking deity. The goddess Sekhmet, depicted with the head of a lioness, was associated with war plague and healing. According to the myth preserved in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, the sun god Ra sent Sekhmet to punish humanity for plotting against him. Sekhmet descended to earth and began slaughtering humans, drinking their blood with such enthusiasm that Ra became concerned she would destroy all of humanity. To stop her rampage, Ra's priests brewed 7,000 jars of beer and dyed it red with ochre to resemble blood. They poured this mixture across the fields. Sekhmet, seeing what she thought was blood, drank until she became intoxicated and fell asleep, ending her killing spree. The myth reveals ancient Egyptian understanding of bloodlust as an uncontrollable force that could consume even a goddess. Greek mythology provides perhaps the most influential ancient source for werewolf legends. The story of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, appears in multiple classical sources, most famously in Ovid's Metamorphoses, written around 8 CE, but drawing on much older oral traditions. According to the myth, Zeus visited Lycaon's court disguised as a traveler. Lycaon, suspicious of his guest's divine claims, decided to test whether the visitor was truly a god. He killed a hostage, cooked the flesh, and served it to Zeus. The god, recognizing the meat as human, was enraged. He destroyed Lycaon's palace with lightning and transformed the king into a wolf. Ovid describes the transformation. In vivid detail, Lycaon's clothes became fur, his arms became legs, his speech became howls. Yet he retained something of his former self, his gray hair, his fierce eyes, his savage nature. The myth gave us the word lycanthropy, from the Greek lykos, wolf, and anthropos, human. The Lycaon myth is significant, not just as a transformation story, but as a meditation on the boundaries between human and animal, civilized and savage. Lycaon's crime-serving human flesh represents the ultimate violation of civilized norms. His punishment, becoming a wolf, makes his inner savagery visible in his outer form. The Greeks saw the wolf as the antithesis of civilization. It lived in the wilderness, hunted in packs, and represented everything that threatened the ordered world of the city-state. But Greek beliefs about the undead and blood-drinking creatures went beyond mythology. The Greeks believed in the vrikolakas, also spelled brukolak or vrikolak, undead creatures that rose from their graves to drain life from the living. These weren't literary inventions, but genuine folk beliefs that shaped burial practices. Archaeological evidence from ancient Greek sites shows bodies buried with stones placed on top of them, a practice designed to prevent the dead from rising. Some graves contained bodies that were decapitated or had heavy objects placed on the chest. These burial practices suggest that fear of the returning dead was real and widespread. Greek and Roman law reflected these beliefs. Some criminals, particularly those who committed suicide or died violently, were buried at crossroads rather than in cemeteries. Stakes were sometimes driven through the bodies. The crossroads burial served multiple purposes. It confused the dead spirit, which wouldn't know which road to follow back to the living. It placed the body in a liminal space, neither fully in the community nor fully outside it. And it allowed the constant traffic of the crossroads to keep the body weighted down and undisturbed. Roman culture inherited and elaborated Greek beliefs about transformation and blood-drinking entities. Roman writers documented beliefs in striges, singular Strix creatures that could transform into birds, usually owls or crows, to fly through the night and drink blood from sleeping children. The poet Ovid describes striges in his Fasti, written around 8 CE. He presents them as either witches, who transform into birds, or as actual bird demons. They attack infants in their cradles, tearing at their flesh with hooked beaks and drinking their blood. Roman parents used various protective measures, hanging herbs over cradles, marking doorways with hawthorn branches, and performing rituals to ward off these creatures. Ovid's Metamorphoses contains numerous transformation stories, including detailed descriptions of humans becoming wolves. In Book 1, he describes Lycaon's transformation with attention to both physical and psychological changes. The king tries to speak but can only howl. He retains his savage nature, but now it's expressed through wolf form rather than human form. In Book 15, Ovid includes a philosophical discussion about transformation, suggesting that all things are constantly changing form, that the boundary between human and animal is less fixed than we imagine. These weren't just literary conceits. Roman law included provisions related to transformation beliefs. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code from around 450 BCE, mentions magical practices and includes penalties for those who used harmful magic. Later Roman law addressed accusations of transformation and blood drinking, though with increasing skepticism from educated elites, even as folk beliefs persisted. What's remarkable about these ancient sources is their geographic and cultural spread. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman Hebrew, and Persian traditions all included blood-drinking entities and human-animal transformations, yet these cultures had limited direct contact during the periods when these beliefs first emerged. The Mesopotamian Lilitu predates significant cultural exchange with Egypt. Greek transformation myths developed independently of Mesopotamian traditions, though later Greek culture absorbed some Near Eastern influences. The consistency across cultures suggests these legends address universal human concerns rather than being transmitted from one culture to another. Several factors might explain this universality. First, all these cultures experienced predation by wolves, lions, and other dangerous animals. The fear of being hunted, of becoming prey, is fundamental to human psychology. Transformation stories might represent this fear, the nightmare of becoming the thing that hunts you, or of your neighbor revealing themselves as predator rather than fellow human. Second, all these cultures struggled to understand death and decomposition. Before modern medicine, the processes that occur in dead bodies, bloating skin changes the appearance of blood around the mouth, would have seemed mysterious and potentially supernatural. The idea that the dead might not stay dead, that they might return to harm the living, addresses fundamental anxieties about mortality. Third, these cultures all valued the distinction between human and animal as central to their self-understanding. Humans were defined by reasoned speech and civilized behavior. Animals acted on instinct and appetite. The transformation from human to animal represented the loss of everything that made one human a fate literally worse than death, because it meant losing one's essential nature. Fourth, blood held special significance in all these cultures. It was associated with life force, with violence, with sacrifice, and with taboo. The consumption of blood was often forbidden or strictly regulated. Creatures that drank blood violated fundamental boundaries, mixing categories that should remain separate: life and death, human and animal, sacred and profane. The archaeological evidence supports the reality of these beliefs. Excavations across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East have uncovered numerous deviant burials, bodies treated in ways designed to prevent them from rising or returning. Bodies buried face down, decapitated, staked, weighted with stones, or buried at crossroads appear in sites from ancient Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. These burial practices weren't rare exceptions, but common enough to appear in multiple sites across centuries. They represent significant investment of labor and resources, suggesting that communities took the threat of the returning dead seriously. The ancient roots of vampire and werewolf legends reveal that these aren't medieval superstitions that arose from ignorance and would disappear with education. Instead, they're fundamental human myths that have persisted for at least 4,000 years and probably much longer. They appear independently in multiple cultures, suggesting they address universal human experiences and anxieties: fear of predation, anxiety about death, concern about the boundaries that separate human from animal and civilized from savage, and the horror of transformation, of becoming something other than what you are. These ancient beliefs would persist, evolve, and spread. As cultures came into contact through trade, conquest, and migration, their monster traditions would mix and influence each other. Greek and Roman beliefs would shape early Christian demonology. Jewish traditions about Lilith would influence medieval European folklore. But the core elements, blood-drinking entities, human-animal transformation, The returning dead remained remarkably consistent across time and space. From these ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions, we turn eastward to examine how Asian cultures develop their own unique vampire and werewolf legends, often with minimal contact with Western traditions, further demonstrating that these monsters arise independently across human cultures. The Chinese Jiangshi and Asian vampire traditions. From the ancient Mediterranean world, where vampire and werewolf legends took root in Western culture, we turn eastward to Asia, where entirely different traditions of the undead developed. These Asian vampire legends emerged independently, with minimal European contact until the colonial period, yet they address similar fundamental questions about death, the soul, and what happens when the dead don't rest peacefully. In Chinese tradition, the undead take a form quite unlike European vampires. The Jiangshi, literally stiff corpse, appears in texts from the Qing dynasty, 1644-1912, though the beliefs almost certainly extend much earlier, rooted in folk traditions that predate written records. The Jiangshi is immediately recognizable in Chinese culture, a reanimated corpse that moves by hopping its body, rigid from rigor mortis arms, stretched out stiffly in front. It wears the clothing it was buried in, often the official robes of the Qing dynasty. Its face is pale or greenish, sometimes covered with mold. Unlike the seductive European vampire, the Jiangshi is grotesque, a clear violation of the natural order. The Jiangshi's distinctive hopping movement has practical origins in Chinese funeral customs. In traditional China families, who died far from their ancestral homes, needed to be returned for proper burial, a journey that could span hundreds of miles. Professional corpse drivers offered a solution. They claimed to use Taoist magic to reanimate corpses, making them walk home at night. In reality, these corpse drivers likely carried bodies on bamboo poles with one end resting on each driver's shoulder. As they walked, the bodies would bounce and sway, creating the appearance of hopping movement when seen from a distance in darkness. This practice, combined with the natural stiffness of rigor mortis, generated the image of the hopping corpse that became central to Jiangshi legends. The creation of a Jiangshi, according to Chinese belief, occurs when a person's hun, the higher ethereal soul, fails to leave the body at death. Chinese philosophy divides the soul into two parts, the hun, which should ascend to heaven, and the po, the earthly soul that remains with the body. If the hun becomes trapped due to improper burial, violent death, suicide, or dying far from home, the body may reanimate, driven by the po's base instincts, but lacking the hun's moral guidance. The result is a creature that seeks life energy, but has no human compassion or reason. Rather than drinking blood, the Jiangshi absorbs qi, the life force that flows through all living things in Chinese philosophy. The Jiangshi approaches sleeping victims and drains their qi through proximity, though some regional variations include blood drinking. Victims become weak-sicken and may die, potentially becoming Jiangshi themselves. The creature is most active at night and is attracted to the breath of the living, which carries qi. The methods for combating Jiangshi reflect Taoist religious practices and Chinese folk beliefs. The most iconic defense is the yellow paper talisman inscribed with spells in red ink or blood. A Taoist priest can stick this talisman to the Jiangshi's forehead, immediately immobilizing it. The talisman works because it reasserts spiritual order, binding the po back to the body and preventing movement. Other protective measures include mirrors, which reveal the Jiangshi's true nature and can repel it. Chicken eggs, which the Jiangshi fears for reasons that vary by region. The blood of a black dog, considered particularly yang, active masculine energy, and thus repellent to the yin, passive feminine energy of death. And holding one's breath, which prevents the Jiangshi from detecting the living person's qi. These beliefs weren't merely entertaining stories. They shaped actual practices around death and burial. Families went to great lengths to ensure proper burial rituals, fearing that failure would trap the Hun and create a Jiangshi. Bodies of those who died far from home were transported back at significant expense. Suicides were particularly feared as potential Jiangshi, leading to specific burial practices designed to prevent reanimation. The beliefs provided a framework for understanding death, the importance of proper ritual, and the dangers of dying improperly or far from home. Beyond China, other Asian cultures developed their own unique vampire traditions, often with no direct connection to Chinese beliefs. In India, the Vatala appears in Sanskrit texts dating back at least to the 11th century, though the legends are likely much older. The Vatala is a spirit that inhabits corpses, hanging upside down from trees in cremation grounds. Unlike the mindless Jiangshi, the Vatala possesses intelligence and knowledge of past, present, and future. The most famous Vatala stories appear in the Baital Pachisi, 25 Tales of the Vampire, where King Vikramaditya must capture a Vatala that tells stories and poses riddles. If the king answers incorrectly or remains silent when he knows the answer, the Vatala escapes and must be captured again. These stories use the Vatala as a vehicle for exploring moral and philosophical questions, making it a very different creature from the predatory vampires of other traditions. In the Philippines, the aswang represents one of the most feared creatures in folklore. By day, the aswang appears as a normal person, often a beautiful woman. By night, she transforms into a monster that preys on pregnant women and children. The aswang has multiple forms, depending on regional tradition. Sometimes a vampire that drinks blood through a long, thread-like tongue that it inserts through cracks in houses. Sometimes a shapeshifter that becomes a dog pig or bird. Sometimes a ghoul that digs up and eats corpses. The aswang's ability to hide in plain sight, appearing normal while harboring monstrous nature, reflects anxieties about trust community and hidden evil. Malaysia and Indonesia share the legend of the Penanggalan, one of the most visually striking vampire creatures in world folklore. The Penanggalan is a woman, often a midwife, or someone who practiced black magic, whose head detaches from her body at night. The head flies through the darkness, trailing its internal organs, stomach, intestines, and entrails behind it, like grotesque tentacles. The Penanggalan feeds on the blood of pregnant women and newborns entering houses through windows or gaps in walls. To protect against it, thorny branches are placed around windows and doors. The thorns catch on the trailing organs, trapping the creature. The Penanggalan must return to her body before dawn and soak her organs in vinegar to shrink them enough to fit back inside her body. The legend may have originated from observations of bioluminescent fungi or insects that glow in the night, combined with fears surrounding childbirth, a dangerous time when both mother and infant were vulnerable. Japan contributes the nuka-kubi, similar to the Penanggalan, but distinctly Japanese in its characteristics. The nuka-kubi's head detaches at night to fly and feed, but the body remains in place, appearing to sleep normally. Some traditions say the nuka-kubi drinks blood. Others say it simply bites people or frightens them. The person who is a nuka-kubi may not even know their own nature. They sleep normally while their head detaches and acts independently. This creates tragic stories of people discovering they are nuka-kubi and struggling with their dual nature. The nuka-kubi legend reflects Japanese concerns about the relationship between conscious and unconscious self, between the person we believe we are and the nature that emerges when we're not in control. What's particularly significant about these Asian vampire traditions is their independence from European influence. Until the colonial period and the arrival of European missionaries and traders, these cultures had minimal contact with European folklore. The Jiangshi developed in China without knowledge of European vampires. The Vatala appears in Indian texts written centuries before significant European contact. The Aswang Penanggalan and Nuka Kubi emerged in Southeast Asian and Japanese cultures that had their own rich mythological traditions. Yet all these cultures independently created legends of the undead that feed on the living, that blur the boundary between life and death, that represent violations of natural order. The differences between Asian and European vampire traditions are as instructive as the similarities. Asian vampires are generally more grotesque and less seductive than their European counterparts. They're often clearly corpses or monsters rather than appearing human. Many Asian vampires drain life force or qi rather than specifically drinking blood, reflecting different philosophical understandings of what animates living beings. The methods for combating Asian vampires often involve religious rituals and talismans rather than the stakes and garlic of European tradition, reflecting different religious frameworks: Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and indigenous beliefs, rather than Christianity. The creation of Asian vampires often emphasizes improper death or burial, rather than the curse or infection model common in European legends. A Jiangshi results from the Hun failing to leave the body. A Penanggalan may be created through black magic or a curse. A Vathala is a spirit that chooses to inhabit a corpse. These creation stories reflect different understandings of the soul, death, and the afterlife. In Chinese philosophy, proper death requires the Hun to ascend and the Po to remain peacefully with the body. In Hindu tradition, the soul should proceed through reincarnation. A Vathala represents a spirit caught between states. These vampires embody failures of proper spiritual transition rather than contagious conditions. Asian vampire legends also reflect specific cultural anxieties. The Jiangshi embodies fears about dying far from home and the importance of proper burial with ancestors. The Penanggalan and Aswang reflect anxieties surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, times of vulnerability when supernatural threats seemed most dangerous. The Nuka Kubi explores the fear of hidden nature, of not knowing one's true self. Each culture's vampires reflect its particular concerns, values, and understanding of the world. These traditions demonstrate that vampire-like legends, creatures that were once human or appear human, that feed on the living, that represent death's intrusion into life, arise independently across human cultures. They're not borrowed from one source and spread globally, but rather emerge from universal human experiences and concerns. Every culture must grapple with death, must create rituals around burial, and mourning must define the boundary between living and dead. And many cultures create legends of creatures that violate that boundary, that refuse to stay dead, that threaten the living. The Asian vampire traditions reveal that while the specific forms vary, hopping corpses, flying heads, spirit-inhabited bodies, the underlying concerns are universal. What happens when death doesn't proceed properly? What if the dead don't rest? What if something that appears human isn't? How do we protect the vulnerable children, pregnant women, the sleeping from supernatural threats? These questions transcend culture, even as each culture answers them in its own way, creating monsters that reflect its own understanding of death, the soul, and the boundary between living and dead. From these Asian traditions that developed independently of European influence, we move to yet another region where vampire legends took unique forms: Africa and the Caribbean, where indigenous beliefs merged with European and other influences to create new vampire traditions that reflected the complex cultural mixing of the colonial era. The African and Caribbean transformations. We've seen how vampire and werewolf legends developed independently across Asia, creating unique forms that reflected each culture's understanding of death and the soul. Now we turn to another region, where monster traditions took distinctive forms but through a very different process, not independent development, but forced cultural collision. and synthesis under the brutal conditions of slavery and colonization. When millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, they carried with them not just their labor but their entire cultural worlds, languages, religions, medical knowledge, and folklore. Among these traditions were rich beliefs about shapeshifters, blood-drinking entities, and the supernatural. In the Americas, these African beliefs encountered European folklore brought by colonizers and indigenous American traditions held by native peoples. The result was something new, syncretic legends that combined elements from multiple sources, creating vampire and werewolf traditions unique to the Caribbean and America's traditions that often encoded resistance to oppression and provided frameworks for understanding trauma. West African cultures had long established traditions of supernatural creatures that fed on life force or blood. Among the Ashanti people of present-day Ghana, the Obaifo was feared as a witch who could leave her body at night. The Obaifo spirit would exit through any opening in the body and transform into a ball of light, similar to what we might call a will-o'-the-wisp. In this form, the Obaifo would fly through the darkness to the homes of sleeping victims, particularly targeting children. The spirit would hover over the sleeping child and drain their blood or life force, causing the child to sicken and potentially die. The Obaifo could be identified by certain signs: an unusual brightness in the eyes, a tendency to stare at food with particular intensity, or the ability to emit light from armpits or other body openings. Community members who suspected someone of being an Obaifo would watch for these signs and take protective measures. The Yu people, also from the region that is now Ghana and Togo, feared the Ads, a vampiric entity that could take multiple forms. In its natural state, the Ads appeared as a firefly or other luminous insect. It could also possess humans, transforming them into witches who served its purposes. The Ads drank blood from children and could pass through closed doors and walls in its insect form. Like the Obaifo, it represented a threat that could penetrate the home's defenses, that could appear harmless, just a firefly while harboring deadly intent. The Akan peoples spoke of the Sasabonsam, a creature described as having a humanoid body covered in hair with iron teeth and iron hooks for feet. The Sasabonsam lived in trees in the forest, dangling its legs to catch unwary travelers. It fed on blood and was associated with witchcraft and evil magic. The Sasabonsam represented the dangers of the forest, the wilderness, beyond the safety of the village, and the threat of being caught by something that waited in the darkness above. These weren't just stories told for entertainment. They were part of integrated belief systems that explained misfortune, illness, and death. They provided frameworks for understanding why children died suddenly, why some people seemed to drain the vitality from those around them, why venturing into the forest at night was dangerous. They reinforced community norms and identified those who violated them, and they would survive the Middle Passage, adapting to new environments and new circumstances. In Haiti, African beliefs merged with French colonial culture to create the loup-garou. The name itself reveals the synthesis it derives from the French loup-garou, meaning werewolf, but the creature's characteristics draw heavily from African traditions. The loup-garou is a shapeshifter, often a woman who makes a pact with the devil. At night, she sheds her skin, hiding it in a secret location, and transforms into various animal forms or a ball of fire, similar to the Obaifo. In this transformed state, she flies through the night to drink blood from victims, particularly children. The method for destroying a loup-garou reflects the blending of traditions. If you can find the discarded skin, you must salt it heavily or fill it with pepper. When the loup-garou returns before dawn and tries to put the skin back on, the salt or pepper causes excruciating pain, preventing the transformation back to human form. The creature is then trapped, unable to return to human appearance, and will die with the rising sun. This belief had practical implications. It meant that suspected loup-garous had to be watched. Their movements tracked, their hiding places discovered. The legend created a framework for community surveillance and enforcement of norms. Trinidad and Tobago developed a nearly identical figure called the Sukuyan, though with distinct local characteristics. The Sukuyan also sheds her skin at night, transforms into a ball of fire, and drinks blood from sleeping victims. The protective measures are similar. Salt the skin, place rice or sand outside your door. The Sukuyan must count every grain before entering, and dawn will come before she finishes. Turn your clothes inside out. To confuse her or place a broom behind the door, she must count every straw. These protective rituals gave communities a sense of agency against supernatural threats, practical actions that could be taken to ensure safety. Jamaica contributed the rolling calf, a creature that takes a different form but serves similar functions in folklore. The rolling calf appears as a large bull or calf with glowing red eyes, sometimes breathing fire, often dragging chains that create a distinctive rattling sound. It roams at night, particularly along lonely roads, terrorizing travelers. Some traditions say the rolling calf is the spirit of a wicked person, particularly a cruel overseer or slave owner, condemned to wander as a monster. Others describe it as a shapeshifter that can take human form. The rolling calf represents the dangers of night travel, and significantly often embodies the spirits of oppressors transformed into monsters, a form of supernatural justice. These Caribbean legends weren't simple transplantations of African beliefs. They were genuinely syncretic, combining African-European and sometimes indigenous American elements. The loup-garou takes its name from French werewolf legends, but its characteristics from African vampire traditions. The protective measures, salt rice counting rituals, draw from multiple cultural sources. The creatures themselves often reflect the mixed cultural environment of Caribbean plantation societies, where African, European, and indigenous peoples lived in forced proximity, their beliefs inevitably influencing each other. Importantly, these legends often contained coded resistance to slavery and colonization. The ability to shed one's skin and fly away at night represented a form of freedom, escape from the physical body that was enslaved from the plantation that confined from the brutal conditions of daily life. In a world where enslaved people had no legal freedom of movement, where their bodies were owned by others, the fantasy of leaving the body behind and flying through the night held powerful appeal. The legends provided imaginative space for freedom, even when physical freedom was impossible. The power to transform, to become something other than what you appeared to be, suggested hidden strength and agency. Enslaved people were forced to present themselves as submissive, to hide their true thoughts and feelings, to wear a mask of compliance. The shapeshifter legends reflected this reality, the idea that someone might appear one way, but be something entirely different underneath. This could be threatening. The master's wife might be a Sukuyan, but also empowering. The seemingly powerless enslaved person might have secret powers. Stories circulated on plantations of supernatural creatures punishing cruel masters. A particularly brutal overseer might be attacked by a rolling calf. A master who abused enslaved women might find his children targeted by a loup-garou. These stories provided a framework for imagining justice in a world where legal justice was unavailable to enslaved people. They suggested that even if human law didn't punish cruelty, supernatural forces might. The legends also served practical social functions within enslaved communities. They explained infant mortality, which was tragically common under the harsh conditions of slavery. When a child died suddenly, the loup-garou or Sukuyan provided an explanation that made sense within the community's belief system. The legends enforced community norms, identifying behaviors that marked someone as potentially dangerous. They provided frameworks for understanding and managing conflict within the community, and they maintained cultural continuity, preserving African traditions in adapted form, ensuring that knowledge and beliefs pass from generation to generation despite the disruption of slavery. The vampire and werewolf legends of the Caribbean also reveal the complexity of cultural transmission under colonialism. These weren't pure African traditions, preserved unchanged, nor were they simply European beliefs adopted by enslaved peoples. They were new creations born from the collision of cultures under specific historical circumstances. They reflected the realities of plantation life, the mixing of peoples from different African regions and European countries, the presence of indigenous American peoples, and the particular forms that oppression and resistance took in the Caribbean. Modern scholars studying these traditions must navigate complex questions. How much of Caribbean vampire folklore derives from African sources versus European or indigenous American? How did beliefs change as they were transmitted across generations in the Americas? What did these legends mean to the people who told them? Were they literal beliefs, metaphorical frameworks, or something in between? How did they function in communities, under slavery versus after emancipation? What's clear is that Caribbean vampire and werewolf legends represent remarkable cultural resilience and creativity. Despite the trauma of enslavement, the forced separation from homeland, the suppression of African languages and religions, these traditions survived and adapted. They merged with other traditions to create something new while maintaining connections to African roots. They served multiple functions, explaining misfortune, enforcing norms, imagining resistance, maintaining cultural identity, and providing psychological frameworks for understanding and surviving oppression. These legends remind us that folklore isn't static. It adapts to new circumstances, absorbs new influences, and serves the needs of the communities that maintain it. The vampire and werewolf traditions of the Caribbean demonstrate how monster legends can be vehicles for cultural preservation, resistance to oppression, and making sense of historical trauma. They show how people under extreme duress create and maintain belief systems that help them understand their world and imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. From these Caribbean traditions born of cultural collision and synthesis, we return to Europe to examine how vampire and werewolf legends were transformed once more. This time not through cultural mixing, but through literature, as writers took folklore traditions and created the literary vampires and werewolves that would dominate popular imagination and shape how we understand these monsters today. The birth of the literary vampire. From the folklore traditions that emerged from cultural collision in the Caribbean, we return to Europe where vampire legends would undergo another transformation. This time not through cultural mixing, but through literature. In the early 19th century, writers would take the peasant revenants of folklore and transform them into something entirely new. Sophisticated seductive aristocrats who would define how we imagine vampires today. The summer of 1816 was unlike any other in European memory. The previous year, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted with unprecedented violence, ejecting so much ash into the atmosphere that it altered global weather patterns. The summer of 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Temperatures dropped, crops failed across Europe and North America, and persistent rain and darkness created an atmosphere of gloom and foreboding. It was in this strange, cold summer that a small group of English writers gathered at the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a gathering that would change the course of horror literature and create the modern vampire. The group included some of the most notable figures of English Romanticism. Lord Byron, the celebrated poet, had rented the villa. His personal physician, John William Polidori, accompanied him. Nearby, in a smaller house, stayed Percy Bysshe Shelley, his lover Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley, and Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont, who was pregnant with Byron's child. The weather kept them indoors for much of their stay, They read ghost stories, translated from German-discussed philosophy and science, and talked late into the night by candlelight. On June 16, 1816, Byron proposed a challenge. Each of them should write a ghost story. Mary Shelley would create Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, which would become one of the foundational works of science fiction. Byron began a fragment about a vampire, but never completed it. Percy Shelley started a story based on his childhood experiences, but abandoned it. But John Polidori, often overlooked, in accounts of that summer, would produce something that would prove remarkably influential, The Vampire, published in 1819. Polidori's story was revolutionary in its conception of the vampire. The central character, Lord Ruthven, was an aristocrat who moved through London high society. He was described as attractive in an unsettling way, with a pale complexion and a gaze that seemed to penetrate to the soul. He was wealthy, sophisticated, and charming qualities that made him welcome in the best drawing rooms. But Ruthven was also a predator who used his social position to seduce and destroy his victims. The story follows a young man named Aubrey who becomes Ruthven's companion and gradually discovers his true nature, but only after Ruthven has seduced and killed Aubrey's sister. This was a complete departure from folklore vampires. The vampires of Eastern European tradition were peasant revenants, bloated corpses that rose from graves to attack family members and livestock. They were clearly monstrous, obviously dead, and operated in rural settings among the lower classes. Polidori's vampire was sophisticated, attractive, and moved through urban high society. He was dangerous precisely because he didn't appear monstrous. He could pass as human as one of the elite, making him far more threatening than any shambling corpse. Polidori based Lord Ruthven explicitly on Lord Byron himself. The character's name came from Glenarvan, a novel by Lady Caroline Lamb, one of Byron's former lovers, in which she had portrayed Byron as a character named Lord Ruthven. Polidori, who had a complicated relationship with Byron marked by both admiration and resentment, created a vampire that embodied what he saw as Byron's predatory sexuality and his destructive effect on those around him, particularly women. The vampire as aristocratic seducer was born from Polidori's ambivalent feelings toward his famous employer. When The Vampire was published in 1819 in New Monthly magazine, it was initially attributed to Lord Byron rather than Polidori. This misattribution, whether accidental or deliberate, significantly increased the story's popularity. Byron's name sold copies. The story became a sensation across Europe, translated into multiple languages, and adapted for the stage. In France alone, it inspired at least 5 theatrical adaptations within a few years. The image of the aristocratic vampire entered popular culture and began to displace the folklore vampire in the public imagination. The story's success reflected anxieties of its era. Post-Napoleonic Europe was a time of social change and uncertainty. The aristocracy, though still powerful, faced challenges from rising middle classes. There were concerns about aristocratic corruption, about the abuse of power by the wealthy, about the vulnerability of young women to seduction by men of higher social status. Polidori's vampire embodied these anxieties. He was an aristocrat who used his position to prey on those beneath him, who appeared civilized but harbored monstrous appetites, who represented the danger lurking behind the polished surface of high society. The template was set, but it would be refined and elaborated by subsequent writers. In 1872, Irish writer Sheridan Le Fanu published Carmilla, a novella that added new dimensions to the literary vampire. Le Fanu's vampire was female Carmilla, a beautiful young woman who befriends the narrator Laura and gradually drains her life. The story contains explicit lesbian themes, with Carmilla expressing passionate love for Laura in language that goes far beyond Victorian friendship. Carmilla introduced the idea of the vampire as a figure of forbidden sexuality, of desire that transgressed social norms. It also established many conventions that would become standard in vampire fiction. The vampire's inability to enter a home uninvited the use of religious symbols as protection, and the need to destroy the vampire in its grave. But the culmination of 19th century literary vampire development came in 1897 with Bram Stoker's Dracula. Stoker was an Irish theater manager who had been researching vampire legends for years. His notes preserved in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia show that he read extensively about Eastern European folklore, consulted books about Transylvania and Romanian history, and carefully constructed his novel to combine folklore authenticity with literary innovation. Stoker's novel tells the story of Count Dracula, a Transylvanian nobleman who travels to England to spread his curse. The story is told through diary entries, letters, and newspaper clippings, a technique that creates a sense of documentary realism. Dracula is ancient, powerful, and sophisticated, but he's also more monstrous than Polidori's Ruthven. He can transform into a bat wolf or mist. He casts no reflection and no shadow. He must sleep in his native soil. He's repelled by garlic crucifixes and holy wafers. He can be killed by a stake through the heart, decapitation, or exposure to sunlight. Stoker drew on multiple sources. He borrowed the name Dracula from Vlad III of Wallachia, though his research on the historical Vlad was limited and contained errors. He incorporated elements from Carmilla, including the idea of the vampire as seducer and the methods for destroying vampires. He drew on folklore research, particularly Emily Gerard's article, Transylvanian Superstitions, published in 1885, which described Romanian vampire beliefs, and he added his own innovations, creating a vampire that was both aristocratic predator and folkloric monster. Dracula was more than a horror story. It embodied Victorian anxieties about sexuality, particularly female sexuality. The vampire's bite transforms proper Victorian women into sexually aggressive beings, a fate presented as worse than death. The novel reflects fears about foreign threats, with Dracula representing the invasion of civilized England by Eastern European barbarism. It engages with contemporary concerns about disease and contagion, with vampirism spreading like an epidemic, and it explores tensions between traditional religion and modern science, with the vampire hunters using both crucifixes and blood transfusions in their battle against Dracula. The novel was successful but not immediately recognized as the classic it would become. It sold steadily and was adapted for stage in 1897, with Stoker himself writing the adaptation. But it was the 20th century, particularly the 1931 film starring Bela Lugosi, that would make Dracula the definitive vampire story and establish Stoker's Count as the archetypal vampire in popular imagination. The transformation from folklore to literature fundamentally changed the vampire. The literary vampire was no longer simply a returned corpse, a manifestation of improper burial or disease. It became a complex figure that could embody multiple meanings: aristocratic corruption, sexual danger, foreign threat, the dark side of human nature, the tension between civilization and savagery. The literary vampire was seductive rather than merely monstrous, intelligent rather than instinctual, eternal rather than merely undead. This transformation also made the vampire a more flexible symbol. Writers could use vampires to explore whatever themes interested them: sexuality, class conflict, colonialism, disease, addiction, or the nature of evil itself. The vampire became a mirror in which each era could see its own anxieties reflected. The folklore vampire had been relatively fixed in meaning a threat to be destroyed, an explanation for death and disease. The literary vampire was open to interpretation, capable of being villain, tragic figure, or even hero depending on how the writer chose to portray it. The literary vampire also became divorced from its folkloric roots. Readers of Dracula might not know anything about actual vampire beliefs in Eastern Europe. The novel's Transylvania was a Gothic fantasy rather than a real place. The vampire's characteristics, the inability to cross running water, the aversion to garlic, the transformation into bats became fixed in popular imagination, even though they varied widely in actual folklore or were Stoker's inventions. Literature created a standardized vampire that would influence all subsequent vampire fiction, overshadowing the diverse traditions from which it had emerged. The birth of the literary vampire at the Villa Diodati in 1816 and its development through the 19th century represents a crucial moment in the history of monster legends. It shows how folklore can be transformed by literature, how writers can take traditional beliefs and reshape them to address contemporary concerns. It demonstrates the power of literature to create lasting images that supersede their sources, and it reveals how monsters evolved to reflect the anxieties of their time, the literary vampire embodying Victorian concerns about sexuality, class, and modernity, just as folklore vampires had embodied earlier concerns about death, disease, and proper burial. From these 19th century literary creations, the vampire would continue to evolve through the 20th and 21st centuries, becoming increasingly sympathetic and complex. But the foundation was laid in that dark summer of 1816 and refined through the Victorian era, the vampire as seductive aristocrat, as sexual predator, as sophisticated monster, hiding in plain sight among civilized society. We turn now from literature to science, examining how modern researchers have attempted to explain the physical phenomena that convinced earlier generations they had discovered vampires, the processes of decomposition that created the signs of vampirism, and how understanding these processes changes our interpretation of historical vampire cases. The science of decomposition and vampire signs. We've explored how literature transformed folklore vampires into sophisticated aristocratic predators. But what about the original folklore itself? What were people actually observing when they exhumed bodies and declared them vampires? Modern forensic science provides answers that would have seemed impossible to 18th century villagers. Answers that reveal how natural processes, misunderstood, became evidence of the supernatural. When communities in 18th century Eastern Europe opened graves to investigate suspected vampires, they knew exactly what signs to look for. These signs had been passed down through generations, discussed by village elders, and documented by authorities who investigated vampire cases. The signs were consistent across regions: a body that appeared undecayed despite weeks or months of burial, a bloated, well-fed appearance rather than the expected emaciation of death, fresh blood around the mouth and nose, skin that appeared pink or ruddy rather than pale, hair and nails that seemed to have grown, old skin that had peeled away to reveal fresh skin beneath, and perhaps most disturbing, blood that flowed when the corpse was staked, sometimes accompanied by sounds that witnesses described as groans or sighs. To communities without knowledge of decomposition processes, these signs provided clear evidence that the dead person had become a vampire, rising from the grave to feed on the living. Modern forensic science tells a very different story. Every sign that convinced our ancestors they had discovered vampires can be explained by normal post-mortem processes. Processes that occur in every dead body, though at different rates depending on environmental conditions. Understanding these processes doesn't diminish the reality of what people observed. It simply provides a different framework for interpretation. The process of decomposition begins immediately at death. When the heart stops beating, cells no longer receive oxygen. Without oxygen, cells begin to die and break down. But while human cells die quickly without oxygen, the bacteria that live in our bodies, particularly in the intestines, continue to function. These bacteria, no longer kept in check by the immune system, begin to spread throughout the body. As they consume tissue, they produce gases primarily methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. This is the beginning of what forensic scientists call the bloat stage of decomposition. The gases produced by bacterial action accumulate in the body cavity, particularly in the abdomen and chest. The body swells sometimes dramatically. The abdomen distends, the limbs puff up, and the face becomes bloated. To observers who expected a corpse to appear thin and wasted, this bloated appearance seemed like evidence that the dead person had been feeding. The body looked well-nourished, full, even fat. In reality, it was full of gas, not blood or food. But without understanding bacterial gas production, the bloated appearance seemed to confirm that the corpse had been rising to feed on the living. The gas buildup creates pressure inside the body. This pressure can force fluids upward and outward. Blood and other fluids in the lungs can be pushed up through the trachea and out through the mouth and nose. This creates the appearance of fresh blood around the mouth, one of the most convincing signs of vampirism to historical observers. The blood wasn't fresh. It was post-mortem purge fluid, a mixture of decomposition, fluids forced out by gas pressure. But to someone who didn't understand this process, it looked exactly like the blood of recent victims, still wet on the corpse's lips. The gas pressure inside a decomposing body can also cause sounds. When a body is moved or when a stake is driven through it, the pressure is released suddenly. Gas escapes through the mouth, producing sounds that witnesses described as groans, sighs, or even screams. These sounds were deeply disturbing to those who heard them, seeming to prove that the corpse was still somehow alive or animated. In reality, they were simply the sound of gas escaping, similar to the sound made when air is released from a balloon, but emerging from a human body in a way that seemed eerily voice-like. The appearance of hair and nail growth on corpses was another sign that convinced observers they had found vampires. Historical accounts frequently mention that exhumed bodies had longer hair and nails than when they were buried. But hair and nails don't actually continue to grow after death. What happens is that the skin dehydrates and shrinks, retracting away from the hair follicles and nail beds. This makes hair and nails appear longer even though they haven't grown at all. The effect can be quite pronounced. Nails that were trimmed at burial might appear to have grown a quarter inch or more, simply because the skin around them has receded. Similarly, the appearance of new skin beneath old skin had a natural explanation. As a body decomposes the outer layer of skin, the epidermis can separate from the underlying dermis. This outer layer may peel away in sheets, revealing the layer beneath. To observers, this looked like old dead skin falling away to reveal fresh new skin underneath, as if the corpse was regenerating. In reality, it was simply the normal process of skin decomposition, with layers separating as the tissues broke down. The rate of decomposition varies enormously depending on environmental conditions. Temperature is perhaps the most important factor. In cold conditions, decomposition slows dramatically. A body buried in frozen ground might show minimal decomposition even months after burial. In warm conditions, decomposition accelerates. A body buried in warm, moist soil might be significantly decomposed within days. Soil composition matters too. Acidic soils tend to accelerate decomposition, while alkaline soils can slow it. Sandy, well-drained soil allows faster decomposition than heavy clay soil. The depth of burial affects temperature and oxygen availability, both of which influence decomposition rate. The condition of the body at death also matters. A person who died from a disease that caused fever might decompose faster due to the elevated body temperature at death and the presence of bacteria from the infection. A person who died from blood loss might appear less bloated because there's less fluid in the body to be forced out by gas pressure. The presence of embalming or preservation attempts, even rudimentary ones, could slow decomposition. All these variables meant that two bodies buried at the same time in the same cemetery might look completely different when exhumed weeks later. This variability made decomposition seem mysterious and unpredictable to historical observers. Why did one body appear fresh while another, buried at the same time, was clearly decomposed? Without understanding the factors that influence decomposition rate, this variation seemed to support the idea that some corpses were different, that they had become vampires, and therefore didn't decay normally. In reality, the undecayed corpses were simply decomposing more slowly due to environmental factors. Some exhumed bodies appeared remarkably preserved with pink or reddish skin that looked almost alive. This phenomenon, which particularly convinced observers they had found vampires, can result from specific soil conditions. In some environments, bodies can undergo a process called saponification, where body fats convert into a waxy substance called adipocere. This substance can preserve the body's shape and give the skin a pale, waxy appearance. In other conditions, particularly in peat bogs or very acidic soils, bodies can be preserved through a tanning process, similar to leather making. Some soil conditions can cause the skin to take on a reddish or pinkish color due to chemical reactions with minerals in the soil. None of these processes were understood in the 18th century, so preserved bodies seemed supernatural rather than natural. The phenomenon of incorruptible bodies, corpses that don't decay, has been recognized throughout history and often interpreted as evidence of sanctity in religious contexts. The Catholic Church has investigated numerous cases of saints whose bodies allegedly didn't decay after death. Modern analysis suggests that in most cases these bodies either did decay, but were embalmed or treated in ways that weren't recorded, or they were preserved by natural environmental conditions. The same processes that could create an incorruptible saint could create a vampire in a different cultural context. The interpretation depended on the observer's framework for understanding the phenomenon. When we understand these decomposition processes, the vampire epidemic cases we examined earlier take on new meaning. The Serbian villages where vampire panics occurred in the 1720s and 1730s were experiencing something real. Bodies that appeared undecayed when exhumed, that showed signs that seemed to indicate they had been feeding. But what they were actually experiencing was normal decomposition under specific environmental conditions, interpreted through a cultural framework that explained these phenomena as vampirism. The bodies weren't actually undead. They were simply dead in ways that looked different from what observers expected. This doesn't mean the people who believed in vampires were stupid or irrational. They were observing real phenomena and interpreting them with the knowledge available to them. Without understanding bacterial action, gas production, or the factors that influence decomposition, the vampire explanation made sense. It was consistent with their observations, it fit within their cultural and religious worldview, and it provided a framework for action. If you identified a vampire, you knew what to do about it. The vampire belief was a rational response to observations that seemed to demand a supernatural explanation. The scientific understanding of decomposition reveals something important about how humans create explanations for the world around them. We observe phenomena, we look for patterns, and we create frameworks that make sense of what we see. When those frameworks are based on incomplete information, they can lead to conclusions that seem obviously wrong to later generations with more complete information. But the process of observation and interpretation is the same whether we're creating supernatural explanations or scientific ones. The difference lies in the knowledge base we're drawing from and the methods we use to test our explanations. The vampire signs that terrified communities reveal how supernatural beliefs fill gaps in scientific knowledge, and how the same evidence can support entirely different conclusions depending on one's framework for understanding the world. To an 18th century villager, a bloated corpse with blood around its mouth was obviously a vampire. To a modern forensic scientist, it's obviously a body in the bloat stage of decomposition, with post-mortem purge fluid. Both are looking at the same evidence, but they're interpreting it through completely different frameworks. Neither is seeing incorrectly. They're seeing through different lenses of understanding. This reminds us that what seems obviously supernatural to one era can become obviously natural to another, not because the phenomena change, but because our understanding of them evolves. It also suggests humility about our current explanations. Future generations may look back at beliefs we hold today and wonder how we could have misinterpreted phenomena that will seem obvious to them. The history of vampire beliefs teaches us that observation is only the first step. Interpretation depends on the knowledge and frameworks we bring to what we observe. From this scientific understanding of the physical processes that created vampire beliefs, we turn to our final chapter examining how vampires and werewolves have evolved in modern culture, transforming from monsters to be feared into complex figures that can represent everything from adolescent anxiety to romantic fantasy, a transformation as dramatic as any in their long history. Modern monsters, vampires, and werewolves in contemporary culture. We've traced vampires and werewolves from ancient folklore through medieval panics, from literary transformation to scientific explanation. Now we arrive at the present, where these monsters have undergone perhaps their most dramatic transformation, yet from creatures to be feared and destroyed into romantic heroes, tragic figures and metaphors for the complexities of modern life. In 1976, American writer Anne Rice published Interview with the Vampire, a novel that would fundamentally reshape how Western culture imagined vampires. Rice's protagonist, Louis de Pointe du Lac, was a vampire, but he was also a deeply introspective narrator who questioned the morality of his existence, mourned his lost humanity, and struggled with the philosophical implications of immortality. He wasn't simply evil. He was complex, conflicted, and capable of love, grief, and moral reasoning. The novel presented vampirism not as demonic possession, but as a condition, one that brought both terrible costs and strange gifts. Louis could experience centuries of art, music, and human culture, but he had to kill to survive and watch everyone he cared about age and die. Rice's vampires retained their danger. They were predators who killed humans, but they were no longer simply monsters. They were individuals with personalities, histories, and inner lives. They could be sympathetic, even admirable in some ways, while still being fundamentally other than human. This complexity resonated with readers. Interview with the Vampire became a bestseller and spawned a series that continued for decades, establishing Rice as one of the most influential voices in vampire fiction. The sympathetic vampire gained momentum through the 1980s and 1990s. Other writers explored similar territory, presenting vampires as complex beings rather than simple monsters. Television joined the trend. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which aired from 1991 to 2003, featured Angel, a vampire cursed with a soul who remembered all his victims and sought redemption for centuries of murder. The show explored the possibility of a vampire choosing to be good, struggling against his nature and forming genuine relationships with humans. Angel was dangerous, capable of reverting to his soulless, evil self under certain conditions, but he was also capable of love, sacrifice, and heroism. But the transformation reached its culmination with Stephen E. Meyer's Twilight series, published between 2005 and 2008. Meyer's vampires were no longer monsters struggling with their nature. They were romantic heroes whose dangerous qualities were reframed as intensity and protectiveness. Edward Cullen, the vampire protagonist, sparkled in sunlight rather than burning. He and his family chose to drink animal blood rather than human blood, making them vegetarian vampires. Edward's superhuman strength and speed weren't threats, but assets that allowed him to protect the human protagonist, Bella. His possessiveness and controlling behavior which might be recognized as problematic in a human relationship, were presented as evidence of the depth of his love. Twilight became a cultural phenomenon, particularly among young adult readers. It spawned a film franchise that grossed billions of dollars worldwide. More significantly, it completed the vampire's transformation from monster to romantic ideal. The danger that had made vampires frightening in folklore and thrilling in Gothic literature became in Twilight simply part of their appeal, the bad boy who was dangerous to everyone except the woman he loved. Werewolves followed a similar trajectory. In traditional folklore and early horror fiction, werewolves were purely monstrous humans who transformed into beasts and killed without conscience. But modern fiction increasingly portrayed them as victims of their condition, people struggling with a curse they didn't choose. The werewolf became a metaphor for loss of control for the beast within that everyone fears they might become. In Twilight, the werewolves were portrayed as noble protectors, their transformation a gift that allowed them to defend their community rather than a curse that made them dangerous. Why did this transformation occur? Cultural theorists and literary scholars have proposed several interconnected explanations. First, as traditional religious frameworks weakened in Western culture, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, the clear categories of good and evil became less culturally dominant. Monsters lost their connection to absolute evil and demonic possession. Without that religious framework, vampires and werewolves could be reimagined as morally complex beings rather than manifestations of Satan's power. Second, postmodern thinking, which gained cultural influence from the 1960s onward, questioned binary categories and embraced complexity and ambiguity. The idea that someone could be both monster and person, both dangerous and sympathetic, fit well with postmodern rejection of simple categories. The vampire became a figure for exploring the gray areas between good and evil, human and other self and not self. Third, vampires and werewolves became vehicles for exploring otherness and marginalization. In the 1980s and 1990s, during the AIDS crisis, vampires were sometimes read as metaphors for people living with HIV, stigmatized, feared associated with sexuality and blood, but still human beings deserving of compassion. Vampires could represent any group that society marked as other immigrants, religious minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals, or anyone who felt they didn't fit into mainstream society. The vampire's need to hide their true nature resonated with anyone who had to conceal aspects of their identity to survive in a hostile world. Fourth, the immortal vampire represented both the fear of death and the fear of living too long. In a culture increasingly concerned with aging and mortality, the vampire's eternal youth had obvious appeal. But thoughtful vampire fiction also explored the costs of immortality, watching everyone you love die becoming disconnected from humanity, losing the urgency that mortality gives to life. The vampire became a figure for exploring what makes life meaningful and whether eternal life would be a blessing or a curse. Fifth, werewolves in particular became metaphors for adolescence and the struggle with changing identity. The transformation from human to beast mirrored the physical and emotional changes of puberty. The loss of control, the dangerous new urges, the feeling of becoming something other than what you were all resonated with adolescent experience. Young adult fiction embraced werewolves as symbols of the teenage struggle with identity, anger, and the feeling that one's body and emotions were beyond control. Sixth, the romantic vampire reflected changing attitudes toward sexuality. Victorian vampire fiction had coded vampirism as sexual predation, with the vampire's bite representing illicit sexual contact. Modern vampire romance inverted this. The vampire's bite became an expression of intimate connection, and the vampire's dangerous nature became part of their sexual appeal. This shift reflected broader cultural changes toward more open discussion of sexuality and the eroticization of danger and power in romantic relationships. The sympathetic vampire and werewolf also reflected changing ideas about nature and civilization. Earlier eras had seen civilization as good and nature as dangerous. The werewolf represented the terrifying possibility of reverting to animal nature. Modern environmentalism and critiques of industrial society sometimes inverted this valuation. Nature became authentic and good, while civilization became artificial and corrupt. In this framework, the werewolf's connection to nature could be portrayed as a gift rather than a curse, and the vampire's separation from normal human life could represent freedom from societal constraints rather than damnation. Today, vampires and werewolves appear in every genre and medium. Romance novels feature vampire and werewolf lovers. Young adult fiction uses them to explore teenage identity and first love. Urban fantasy presents vampires and werewolves as part of hidden supernatural communities existing alongside the modern world. Horror writers still use them as monsters, though often with a self-aware acknowledgement that they're working against audience expectations of sympathetic vampires. Comedy uses them for parody and satire. They appear in films, television series, video games, graphic novels, and every other form of contemporary storytelling. The monsters have become so domesticated, so familiar, that some writers and filmmakers have worked to make them frightening again. Films like 30 Days of Night, 2007, and The Descent, 2005, presented vampires and werewolf-like creatures as purely monstrous, stripping away the sympathy and romance. These works represented a reaction against the sympathetic monster trend in an attempt to reclaim the horror that vampires and werewolves had lost. But the sympathetic monster has proven remarkably durable. Even as some creators try to make vampires scary again, others continue to explore them as complex, sympathetic figures. The vampire and werewolf have become flexible symbols that can be adapted to explore whatever themes interest contemporary creators: identity, otherness, sexuality, mortality, power control, nature versus civilization, or the complexity of moral choice. This flexibility is itself significant. Folklore vampires and werewolves had relatively fixed meanings. Within their cultural context, they represented specific threats and embodied specific fears. Literary vampires gained some flexibility, but were still primarily Gothic villains. Modern vampires and werewolves have become almost infinitely adaptable, capable of representing whatever contemporary culture needs them to represent. They've become empty vessels into which we can pour our current anxieties, desires, and questions. The evolution of the vampires and werewolves from folklore monsters to romantic heroes demonstrates how each era creates the monsters it needs. Folklore vampires embodied fears about death, disease, and improper burial. Gothic literary vampires embodied Victorian anxieties about sexuality, class, and foreign threats. Modern sympathetic vampires and werewolves embody contemporary concerns about identity, otherness, mortality, and the complexity of moral choice. The monsters haven't changed, because the phenomena they originally explained have changed. They've changed because we've changed, and we need our monsters to reflect our current concerns rather than those of our ancestors. This transformation also reveals something about how we understand evil and danger in contemporary culture. We're less comfortable with absolute evil than earlier eras were. We want our monsters to have reasons for what they do, to have inner lives and moral complexity. We want to understand them, sympathize with them, perhaps even love them. This reflects a broader cultural shift toward psychological understanding and away from moral absolutism. But it also raises questions. What do we lose when our monsters become sympathetic? If vampires and werewolves are no longer frightening, what do they teach us about danger, about the threats we face, about the darkness that exists in the world and in ourselves? The journey from Vlad the Impaler to Edward Cullen, from the Beast of Gévaudan to the Werewolves of Twilight, represents one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of folklore and popular culture. We've taken creatures that once terrified communities that were blamed for real death and real suffering, and transformed them into romantic heroes and metaphors for teenage angst. We've taken monsters and made them human. Or perhaps we've recognized that they were always reflections of our humanity, our fears and desires projected onto imagined creatures that allowed us to explore what we couldn't confront directly. Vampires and werewolves endure not because they represent timeless truths about evil, but because they're adaptable enough to represent whatever each era needs them to represent. They've survived for thousands of years by changing and by reflecting each culture's particular anxieties and desires. They began as explanations for death and disease, became symbols of sexual danger and foreign threat, and have now become metaphors for identity, otherness, and the complexity of being human in the modern world. What they'll become next depends on what future generations need them to be, what fears they need to name, what desires they need to explore, what questions about humanity they need to ask through the lens of the monstrous and the other. Over the past 2 hours and 15 minutes, we've journeyed through more than 4,000 years of vampire and werewolf history. We began with Vlad III of Wallachia, whose brutal methods of maintaining power in 15th century Eastern Europe would inspire literature's most famous vampire, though the historical prince bore little resemblance to the supernatural creature that borrowed his name. We examined Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian Countess whose case raises difficult questions about truth propaganda and the persecution of powerful women, questions that remain unresolved centuries later. We explored medical explanations for vampire legends from the Porphyria theory that captured public imagination despite scientific criticism, to the more compelling case for rabies as a disease that literally transformed victims into aggressive biting creatures who spread their condition to others. We discovered how normal decomposition processes bloating blood around the mouth sounds from escaping gases convinced communities they had discovered the undead, revealing how supernatural beliefs filled gaps in scientific knowledge. We traced these legends to their ancient roots in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, finding blood-drinking demons and transformation stories in humanity's earliest written texts. We traveled east to discover how Asian cultures independently developed their own vampire traditions, the hopping Jiangshi of China, the Vetala of India, the Penanggalan of Malaysia, each reflecting that culture's understanding of death and the soul. We explored how African beliefs merge with European and indigenous traditions in the Caribbean, creating syncretic legends that encoded resistance to slavery and provided frameworks for understanding trauma. We witnessed the transformation of folklore monsters into literary figures at the Villa Diodati in 1816, where a stormy summer gathering produced both Frankenstein and the template for the aristocratic vampire. We saw how Bram Stoker combined folklore research with literary innovation to create Dracula, establishing conventions that would dominate vampire fiction for over a century. And we traced the vampire's evolution through the 20th and 21st centuries, from monster to romantic hero, from figure of absolute evil to complex metaphor for identity, otherness, and the struggles of modern life. What emerges from this exploration is a picture of how humans create and recreate monsters to address the concerns of each era. Folklore vampires and werewolves explained death, disease, and predation in ages before modern medicine. They provided frameworks for understanding why children died suddenly, why bodies didn't decompose as expected, why communities experienced waves of illness. The vampire belief wasn't irrational superstition, but a coherent explanatory system based on observation and tradition interpreted through the knowledge available at the time. As scientific understanding advanced, these monsters didn't disappear, they transformed. Literary vampires embodied Victorian anxieties about sexuality, class, and foreign threats. Modern sympathetic vampires and werewolves represent contemporary concerns about identity, moral complexity, and what it means to be human in a world that increasingly questions binary categories and absolute truths. Each era creates the monsters it needs, projecting its fears and desires onto imagined creatures that allow exploration of what cannot be confronted directly. This history matters because it reveals something fundamental about how humans make sense of the world. We observe phenomena, death, disease, violence, transformation, and we create frameworks to understand them. When those frameworks are based on incomplete information, they can lead to conclusions that later generations recognize as mistaken. But the process of observation and interpretation remains constant whether we're creating supernatural explanations or scientific ones. The difference lies not in the quality of observation, but in the knowledge base we bring to what we see. The vampire and werewolf legends also demonstrate the remarkable persistence and adaptability of folklore. These stories have survived for thousands of years by changing, by absorbing new influences, by reflecting each culture's particular concerns. They began as explanations for natural phenomena, became symbols of social anxieties, and have now become flexible metaphors that can represent whatever contemporary culture needs them to represent. This adaptability ensures they'll likely continue evolving for thousands of years, more taking forms we cannot yet imagine to address concerns we have not yet developed. History is not static. New discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of the past. Archaeological excavations uncover burial practices that reveal how communities tried to prevent the dead from rising. Medical historians identify new connections between disease patterns and vampire panics. Literary scholars discover how folklore traditions influenced writers in ways previously unrecognized. Each generation brings new questions and new methods to the study of these legends, finding meanings that earlier researchers missed. What studying these legends gives us is perspective on how humans have always struggled to understand death, disease, and danger, on how we create stories to make sense of phenomena that frighten us, on how those stories change as our knowledge and concerns evolve. The vampire and werewolf aren't just monsters from the past. They're mirrors that reflect human psychology across time, showing us what each era feared, what it desired, and how it understood the boundaries between human and other living and dead, natural and supernatural. There's something profound in recognizing that the same evidence can support entirely different conclusions depending on the framework we use to interpret it. An 18th century villager and a modern forensic scientist looking at the same exhumed body see completely different things. One sees a vampire, the other sees normal decomposition. Neither is observing incorrectly. They're seeing through different lenses of understanding. This reminds us to approach both historical beliefs and our own contemporary certainties with humility, recognizing that future generations may look back at what we consider obvious and wonder how we could have misinterpreted phenomena that will seem clear to them. The journey from ancient Mesopotamian demons to modern romantic vampires, from the Beast of Gévaudan to contemporary werewolf fiction, represents one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of human storytelling. We've taken creatures that once terrified communities that were blamed for real deaths and real suffering and transformed them into romantic heroes and metaphors for adolescent identity struggles. We've taken monsters and made them human. Or perhaps we've recognized that they were always reflections of our humanity, our fears and desires projected onto imagined creatures that allowed us to explore what we couldn't confront directly. Thank you for joining this journey through the real history of vampires and werewolves. If you're still awake and found this exploration worthwhile, There are other historical mysteries and documented phenomena waiting in the playlist. But for now, whether you're drifting towards sleep or have traveled this entire path with full attention, rest well. Good night.